But in the GLA Act, it states that the Mayor should promote, and I quote, economic development and wealth creation in Greater London. Given that Brexit, particularly the prospect of a catastrophic no-deal Brexit, the consequences of which have been bare for all to see in the Yellowhammer documents published last night, is the single biggest issue in modern history that could negatively impact London's economy, jobs and living standards for decades to come, I see it as my duty to speak up for what's in the best interests of our city. I do not apologise for this. I welcome the motion against a no-deal Brexit that the Assembly passed last week, and I want to thank those Assembly members who are refusing to stay silent on this vital issue and who are bravely putting London's interests ahead of any political interest by making their voice heard. Chair, I also want to highlight that today I've written to every head teacher in London to give my full support to LGBTQ+ inclusive relationship education. Our schools must be places where all children feel safe and included. Young people should be able to learn about healthy relationships of all kinds, and that includes LGBTQ+ relationships. Since we last met, I've also been working on a number of other initiatives to improve the lives of Londoners. This includes continuing to help build more social and council homes, ensuring our transport system remains affordable for all, cleaning up our air and making London's electric bus fleet the largest in Europe, and continuing to do everything possible to tackle violent crime, not only by cracking down on criminals, but by tackling the root causes of violent crime. I look forward to answering further questions during the course of this morning. I've also, Chair, as you know, been asked to give three oral updates. Yeah. The first oral update is from Senator Bashan Berry in relation to facial recognition. The use of facial recognition by the King's Cross Central Limited Partnership in the King's Cross development was raised with me last month. I then wrote to the Chief Executive to express my concern. I also asked that he engage with both my Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe, as he develops the Public London Charter, and the Information Commissioner's Office. The CEO replied, setting out the current situation, that a previous facial recognition system had been in place and in operation on the site, which has been replaced, but that the King's Cross Central Limited Partnership now has no plans to introduce facial recognition on the estate. At the same time, Senator Member Berry received a written answer to a Mayor's question about the exchange of images between private sector organisations and the Met for use in facial recognition. This was sent from MOPAC to the Met for a detailed reply, and MOPAC were assured that no such exchange had taken place. We now know that this information was wrong, and the Met have apologised for this. A local agreement was in place, meaning that images were exchanged between 2016 and 2018. A revised answer was provided to Senator Berry on the 4th of September. Chair, I've asked the Met to assure me that no other agreements of this type were or are in place. I expect to receive the report of this work later this month. The Met have also written to all BCU commanders, making it clear there should be no local agreements on the sharing of data or local use of live facial recognition. Can I also, Chair, thank Senator Hall for a request for an oral update on the problems on the Metropolitan line. On the 1st of September, a further section of new signalling was introduced between Finchley Road and Euston Square and Latimer Road and Euston Square. This was a huge step forward in TfL signalling overhaul on some of the oldest and busiest parts of the network. Introducing a new system in a live environment is a huge change which can take some time to settle. Unfortunately, Metropolitan line customers experienced disruption as a result. TfL have rightly apologised for this disruption. Although all train operators were trained to operate the new signalling, as part of TfL's commitment to safety, all train operators had to be accompanied through the new section by an instructor the first few times they went through the new area. TfL expected delays to Met line services and rolled out a programme of communications in advance and ahead of Monday's service to warn customers of the anticipated disruption. Last Monday, a number of train operators weren't able to complete familiarisation due to a defective train at Finchley Road, preventing trains getting through the area. This, as well as other unconnected incidents, had a knock-on impact on the availability of train operators, and consequently, the rate at which drivers could be familiarised was slower than anticipated. TfL has been working to restore a good service with an increased number of trains available each day. Customers who have been delayed by more than 15 minutes and whose journeys have changed are being automatically refunded. There is now a mostly good service in the whole of the line. TfL is reviewing plans as future sections of the new signalling are introduced to ensure disruption is kept to a minimum. The upgrade is one of the most important in the history of the tube. With each phase of new signalling, customers will get a better service. And the final update, can I thank the Member Pigeon, is in relation to fatigue management of tram drivers. At nearly 3 years on from the tragic accident at Sandylands, our thoughts remain with everyone affected. Both I and TfL are committed to ensuring a tragedy like this never happens again. Earlier this month, there was a media report that Transport for London removed comments from an audit of fatigue controls at Tram Operations Limited, TOL, the company that operates the London Tramlink service. As my Deputy Mayor for Transport explained in detail at the Trans Committee yesterday, it is standard practice when carrying out audits to share and discuss findings with those being audited before finalising the report to ensure any factual inaccuracies are corrected. The process resulted in some revisions and reordering of the draft accuracy, but the evidence and recommendations were not changed. In the draft report, which I shared with Assemblymember Pigeon, the recommendations were listed as priority 1 and priority 2 issues. In the final report, they were listed, and I quote, opportunities for improvement. I've been informed that no evidence and no recommendations were deleted from the draft internal audit report. Notwithstanding this, Deputy Mayor Alexander, the Deputy Mayor for Transport, agreed to discuss with the Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer on reviewing the internal auditing process and also to include TfL's General Counsel. TfL is fully committed to supporting all those affected by the Sandylands tragedy in any way they can, and they've always cooperated fully with all of the investigating bodies following the tragedy. Significant progress, Chair, has been made on the recommendations set out by the RAIB, and TfL has already completed some of the most vital ones, including reducing speeds, enhanced signage, and a system that detects fatigue and distraction. By the end of this year, a new automatic braking system will be in operation on the London network, which will be the first for trams in the UK.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got follow-up questions from Assemblymember Berry and Assemblymember Hall, and it's out of your group time.
Thank you, Chair. So firstly, Mr Mayor, I'd like to thank you for the apology that came with the revised answer and by email from your Deputy Mayor about the serious inaccuracy that occurred with my Mayor's question. That's very much appreciated. My submitted question here today, I had planned to have quite a wide-ranging discussion with you about human rights, but I think given what's happened, this is a bit of casework that I should discuss now. So my first question, and I ask this because the Police and Crime Committee discussed facial recognition with the Met the day before the new information was published, is when did you find out that the answer you had given me was wrong?
Straight away, as soon as I discovered it was wrong, I wrote you, I think, the same day or literally maybe the day afterwards, but straight away.
So you found out the day after the Police and Crime Committee as well?
I'll give you the exact timelines, but it would have been, as soon as I found out, I straight away got in touch with you.
The exact time would be useful, just to make sure I've got the timeline correct on that. My second question is about how I was given a wrong answer to my question. And I assume your office and MOPAC have processes and inquiry processes to prevent this. How did this answer fail those checks?
So what happens is the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime asks the Met Police Service for a briefing. They provide the briefing. The Mayor's Office of Police and Crime then provide it to me. I think in this example what happened was the local information taking place between the local BCU and, in this case, King's Cross, wasn't passed up to the people who passed the information back to the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime. And that's one of the reasons why the Met Police apologised, but also I've asked for a report from the MPS. And I can't see any reason why I won't share that with you once I get that report, because I think what's key, and I think this is why it's welcome the MPS apology and them doing this report that I've asked for, is if there are any procedures that need improvement. For example, if people higher up don't know what's going on locally, that's a problem. But the good news is that the MPS have written to all BCUs to make sure they're aware there should be no sharing of facial recognition with private contractors.
That's useful to know. I mean, the fact that they are still writing to local forces and your update to me does imply there is more to come. You've promised a further update to Assembly
I think we need to
members.
find out. I think the short answer is we don't know, but I want the reassurance, as I'm sure Londoners do as well.
Can you confirm the answer to my question is still incomplete and you'll provide further updates on the question as well?
The answer to your question is accurate at the time of writing, but it may well change as we get more information from the report I've asked for from the Met Police Service.
Okay, just to make sure a full answer is on the database in the end would be useful.
I'll make sure. I'm happy, Chair, if there's an interest to copy in Assembly members, because I appreciate Londoners will be concerned about how the public realm is dealt with.
Absolutely. So far in your investigations, do you know of any further incidences that the Met has uncovered?
Just to be clear, there's no investigation from me. I've asked the MPS for a report in relation to what went wrong, what's going on, and they'll provide the report. Once I get the report from the MPS, as I said, I can't see a reason why that shouldn't be shared with members of the Assembly.
In respect of King's Cross, in response to the BBC, the British Transport Police say they handed over a watch list relating to crime and antisocial behaviour, which we assume means persistent begging. I suspect this is the same case for the Met, so can you tell me what kinds of people were on the watch list that was supplied to Argent at King's Cross?
I simply don't know. That's one of the things I've asked for. I mean, the chronology is, I responded to the Mayor's question and then subsequently was told, in fact, there had been, which said there'd been no sharing. I was subsequently told there actually may have been sharing, which is why I corrected the answer to you and apologised and asked for a report. Once I've got the report, I'll be able to let you know the substance. I suspect, just looking in from out, it was probably crime prevention advice, but I just don't know.
Okay, I mean, I ask this because, I mean, we know that the public only ever supports the use of facial recognition in limited circumstances and only for serious crimes. And begging and being homeless is not a serious crime. Well,
that's an assertion. The position is, I mean, the public needs to give consent. My view is very simple. The two biggest objections would be public not giving consent, and there's informed consent and there's express consent. And secondly, what happens to the database, who's shared with and stuff. Those are the two biggest issues. You'll be aware of a separate legal case taking place, and there's going to be appeal taking place. There are other issues about the lack of regulation, the technology advancing. There's other concerns about the use of this by the private sector. There's other concerns about how the public realm is policed, inverted commas, small p, by private developers. And that's one of the reasons why, for the first time, we have a situation where City Hall, through the Deputy Mayor for Planning, is looking into a public land charter,
I'm well aware of that
which is really important.
This kind of local inconsistency within the police in terms of data sharing is also something we saw with the gangs matrix. And my real concern here, and why I tabled my original question, is whether you and MOPAC are being proactive enough and curious enough and getting ahead of these kinds of human rights issues before the Met stumbles into making mistakes like this. I mean, it was my MQ that drew this out, but isn't it a question you should have been asking?
Well, to be fair, we've been lobbying the government for some time now. One of the concerns both the Commissioner...
This is in terms of what the Met is doing.
Both in terms of the Commissioner and also in terms of the Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime and myself is lobbying the government to keep abreast with the advances taking place in technology. It is a fact. Many of us who have mobile phones of a certain type use facial recognition in relation to unlocking our phone. We give consent to do so. So the technology is there, and the lobbying from the government, lobbying to the government from the police has been, we need regulation to let us know how we should be using this. In the absence of regulation, what the police have done in London, unlike other police forces, is have pilots. Informing the public these pilots are taking place, whether it's at Carnival, whether it's outside the Cenotaph during Remembrance Day, so the public are aware of this and making sure they test the pilots and aren't just rolling this out. So that's the appropriate way for a police service to behave. But the key issue is for the government to pass the regulation and change the laws. The other big issue is the number of commissioners. We've got a surveillance commissioner.
Well, very sorry, I'm out of time. I am looking forward to your further update to my written question, and thank you for answering it.
Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr Mayor, I note that in your opening comments, yet again, you concentrate on Brexit. I also note that since the 2nd of September, you've written to every MP about Brexit, you've put out a press release regarding Brexit, and you've tweeted out 5 times about Brexit. Since the 2nd of September, anybody using the Metropolitan line has had a hellish commute, both in and out of London. You have not apologised. You are responsible for TfL. Would you like the opportunity to apologise to all those poor travellers?
Well, there are two issues, Chair, raised in the question. I'm sure it would be in order for me to respond to both the issues. One is Brexit.
Not the Brexit one. No,
okay.
This update, just to remind members, the update now is to the specific question, and that was about the Metropolitan line.
Absolutely.
So we won't go into Brexit in your response. It was a nice introduction, but let's stay with the Metropolitan line.
Can I thank all the TfL staff, particularly EU citizens who work so hard on the Metropolitan line? And I'm concerned that the ability of the Met Line service to continue to improve will be diminished if some of these EU staff leave London as a consequence of the no-deal Brexit. The Met Line is a really important line, Chair, and that's one of the reasons why I echo the apology from TfL in relation to the disruption caused to Met Line customers. Many of the customers are EU citizens as well. It's really important that whether you're a customer or whether you're a member of staff, you're looked after. I would say this, though, and I've looked into whether alternatives could have been done. TfL have said the only alternative would have been to close the network on a very large number of additional weekends, which in TfL's judgment would have been much more disruptive to Londoners. So, of course, I echo the apology from TfL. We are making changes to a line that's more than 150 years old, and I apologise for any disruption caused to Met Line customers.
Right, okay, I mustn't mistake you for somebody that actually cares, Mr Mayor. Can you give me a date, or all those tens of thousands of people, for when the current issues on the Metropolitan line will be resolved?
It'll be some time. This line was first built in 1834, I think, and the previous mayor delayed investment in this line. There's going to be 15 signalling sections introduced under a phased approach. This was the second of 15 signalling sections. This disruption is to be experienced, hopefully, mainly at the second and third signalling rollout, whilst drivers are familiarised with the new system in a live environment. Once all drivers are familiarised, this should no longer be an issue. In the meantime, Chair, TfL will be reviewing its plans to ensure any lessons can be applied when future sections of signalling are introduced to ensure disruption is kept to an absolute minimum. So, although I apologise for disruption, I don't apologise for, unlike the previous mayor, investing in the modernisation of these four very important lines, which will increase capacity by more than 60%.
Thank you. Assemblymember Shah, tell me what it's about.
It's regarding Met Line.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I'm pleased that you have apologised for the delays caused on Met Line. Being a regular customer and commuter, I appreciate the efforts that TfL is taking. On that account, can you please explain, give us details, how were the customers informed and when they were regarding the delays on Met Line?
Yeah,
Thanks
for your question. So TfL provided customer information about the anticipated delays the week before the new signalling was implemented. On the Wednesday and Sunday, emails were sent to 128,000 Met Line users, which were read by approximately 45% of recipients. We can tell who's opened the email and read it. TfL also put up posters on all stations along the Met Line on Thursday, and there was an article in Friday's Metro. Tweets went out on Sunday ahead of Monday's service, and throughout the period of disruption, TfL has been providing customers with daily updates and enhanced Twitter support as service information became clearer.
Can you give a commitment that TfL will proactively, regularly continue to advise the commuters of the progress, as well as how to plan their journeys in case of delays?
No, I think it's really important that TfL continues to let Londoners know the investment I'm putting into TfL. But sometimes this investment, record sums, can lead to some disruption. So I'll make sure, with the support of the Assembly, which I've clearly got, to make sure we use TfL remits to let people know of my investment, but also potential disruption as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions on the update. So then let's go to the questions as shown on the order paper. And the first question to you, Mr. Mayor, is from Assemblymember Russell.
Can I again, as I do on this issue, thank the Assembly for her continued support on this very important issue. My ambition was and still is to be the greenest mayor ever, and I'm on track to achieve that. I've been clear that we face a climate emergency and there's an urgent need to clean up London's toxic air. Since becoming mayor, I've set ambitious targets that are some of the boldest in the world. I want London to become a zero carbon and waste city and have the best air quality of any major world city. Since taking office, we've made significant progress in delivering on these goals. London was one of the first 3 mega cities to produce a climate action plan to be compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement, and this year the Carbon Disclosure Project rated London as one of only 7% of cities globally to receive an exclusive A grade for our climate and environment actions. I've introduced the world's toughest emission standard, the ultra-low emission zone, to clean up London's filthy air. The Conservatives opposed bringing this in this year, but this has already seen almost 75% compliance and 9,400 fewer cars driving into central London per day. We've created a new on-street rapid electric vehicle charging point network from 2 points when I became elected to over 200 points now, more than New York or Paris. There are now over 200 electric buses operating in London, now the largest fleet in Europe. And we have 2 exclusively electric double-decker bus routes in London, 43 and 134. These aren't just the first in London or a first in the UK, they're a first for Europe. I've also delivered on my manifesto commitment to deliver 12 low-emission bus zones ahead of schedule. I've also delivered on my commitment to make London the world's first national park city, and I've planted more trees in my first 3 years as mayor than the previous mayor did in 8 years. I'm also taking on an international lead. I'm the vice chair of C40 and I'm working with partners to bring down the prices of electric buses and lobby for greater climate action and tighter environmental standards. However, I only have powers to deliver less than half the emission cuts required to make London zero carbon. We urgently need new policies and funding at national level.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and you know I support several of your initiatives, but it is my job to push you further and to share good ideas from the Greens and the community that can help when there is so much at stake with the climate emergency. Have you got a plan to decarbonise transport in London by 2030?
So the plans we've published are, as you know, 2050, with timelines and resources. The big issue in relation to transport is the grid. And so one of the things we're doing is lobbying the government for both powers and resources. And if we get more powers and resources, we can quite easily move towards 2030. My concern is, at the moment, without the government support, it's difficult to see how we get to 2050. And that's why I mentioned the fact that only half the emissions are transport, the other half, construction, housing, River Thames, aren't in our power. So at the moment, it's difficult to get to zero carbon by 2050, let alone 2030.
So at the moment, there isn't a plan. You've been clear that you're against Heathrow expansion, but you do support expansion at Gatwick. Doesn't that undermine your climate emergency declaration? Well,
firstly, there is a premise in the beginning of your second question which is wrong, which is you said there was no plan to get to 2030 zero carbon. There would be very easily if the government was to give us the powers and resources. Once we know we can get to zero carbon by 2050, it's not difficult, bearing in mind the climate emergency, to move forward to 2030.
Yes, but Mr Mayor, you could have a plan, but can you answer my question about Gatwick, please?
And we've got a plan to get to 2050, and with the right support, we can move there to 2030 as well. In relation to aviation expansion, you'll be aware that I've joined the judicial review in relation to the decision of the government to have a new runway 3. We've been given leave to appeal, and that hearing will be held in October. One of the concerns I've got is that Heathrow appear to be bagging the improvements we've made to air quality through our policies from City Hall as a way of justifying the expansion they want to do in Heathrow. I'm quite clear in relation to expansion in London. I will not support expansion of airports in London if it leads to
but to be clear, you do support expansion at Gatwick?
Well, no, I've been quite clear. If the argument is there needs to be increased aviation capacity in the southeast of the country, there is a much better solution to Heathrow, which is both less environmentally damaging, less damaging to air quality. It's cheaper. It
Mr Mayor, you support aviation expansion at Gatwick.
Well, that's an assertion, not a question. The question I think you're asking is, do I support...
What I'm hearing you say.
Well, what I'm explaining to you is, if the argument is we need increased aviation capacity, the answer is to have that increased aviation capacity not at Heathrow runway 3.
And do you accept that question, do you accept that we need more aviation capacity?
Well, it depends. Well, that's an argument that's got to be made. We know that the Climate Change Committee said there's a number of things got to be satisfied if they're going to support aviation capacity being increased. I'm saying if the argument is we must have increased aviation capacity in the southeast of the country, the answer isn't Heathrow.
Thank you. Would the Greenest Mayor ever build a new motorway tunnel at Silvertown?
There's no motorway tunnel being built at Silvertown, and that misrepresentation of what's happening leads to the public being cynical about politicians, whatever colour you are on the ballot paper. The reality is this. We've got a position in that part of London where the air is toxic, where there can be 2-hour traffic jams caused by Blackwall closing down on average 700 times a year, leading to children in their schools breathing in toxic, poisonous air. we have the least reliable bus going through that tunnel. People don't use it because it's so unreliable. What we're proposing is not to stick a head in the stands, in the sand and have status quo, but to have a solution to the grid lock that exists around that part
Mr.
of
Mayor,
London.
every time you answer this, it gets a bit worse and you sound a bit less convinced. The
Chair,
Greenest
I've got to
Mayor
answer the
ever
question.
would not be supporting business as usual at Gatwick or at Silvertown, and I have no further questions.
Councillor, Assembly Member Russell's out of time. Let's go on then to the next question. It's in the name of Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. You've ruled this question in order, so it must be appropriate, Chair, for me to answer this question, which is on no-deal Brexit. According to the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility, there is a very real risk of a recession in the UK if the UK crashes out of the EU without a deal. A no-deal Brexit would cause huge disruption, making us poorer, less safe and diminish our global standard. It would endanger hundreds of thousands of jobs, tens of billions of pounds in investment, and put the rights and freedoms of EU Londoners at risk. Last week saw MPs from all political parties, including Conservatives, bring forward legislation to rule out a potentially devastating no-deal Brexit at the end of October. The Prime Minister must now seek an extension from the EU by the 9th of October to prevent this from happening. But that only means the threat of no-deal Brexit will be delayed unless the country can figure out how to move forward. I'm extremely concerned that a no-deal Brexit is the government's preferred scenario, despite its own assessment warning that it could lead to consumer panic, rising crime, food shortages and economic chaos, the government's own assessment. It's now a year since I asked the London Resilience Forum to establish the impact of a no-deal Brexit. Well, I've been doing everything within my power to plan for a no-deal Brexit. The very best that can be achieved is merely a mitigation of the worst impacts on Londoners and our city. I've also written to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, to request a meeting to ensure the government is clear about the grave concerns we have, and I'll be meeting him next week. Let's be under no illusions about the dangers of a no-deal Brexit, both here in London and across the UK. These are unprecedented times. The new Prime Minister has no mandate to gamble with the future of the economy and people's livelihoods. The huge risk we now face of no-deal Brexit means that giving people a fresh say on our future is now the right and only approach left for the good of London and the country.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that, Mr. Mayor, and also your initial comments in your statement. We've seen very recently, given moves in Parliament on an absolutely cross-party basis, as you say, to block a no-deal Brexit, that the pound has actually increased in value, which I think, does that show confidence in investing has grown? Do you think that this is something that we need to be worrying about, the effect on the pound and the effect on the City of London and London as a whole?
Well, there are some responsible businesses who are worried about instability. By the way, there are some hedge fund managers, many of them who supported and funded this Prime Minister, who will do very well and who are doing very well out of instability, out of chaos, out of a no-deal Brexit. And some of these people, by the way, made a fortune when the country voted to leave the EU in June 2016 and the pound crashed on that day. So I'm worried about the currency markets. I was speaking to brokers yesterday morning in relation to some of their concerns about the instability and uncertainty and damage to our economy. But let's be frank, some people will make a fortune out of a no-deal Brexit. A few people who support this Prime Minister will make a fortune, but the vast, vast majority of businesses will suffer hugely. Don't just take my word for it. Look at what the OBR are saying. Look at what the Bank of England are saying. I yesterday also met with the CBI, the London Chamber of Commerce, London First, the Federation of Small Businesses, the Institute of Directors. Nobody's talking about sunny uplands.
I mean, there is a very long list of bodies of people who are very concerned, particularly about no-deal Brexit. And the last Prime Minister did spend a lot of time talking about an orderly transition and leaving the EU on an orderly basis to try and mitigate some of these problems. However, there is someone in this room, one of the other Assembly members, who says that a no-deal Brexit is not the greatest challenge facing ordinary Londoners or businesses. Do you agree with that at all?
No, I think anybody who's not willing to stand up to Boris Johnson's no-deal Brexit is unfit to be a member of the Assembly, let alone Mayor of London. I think it's quite clear no deal would be catastrophic for jobs, for growth to families. But look at what the Yellowhammer document published last night in full says. In the short term...
I think we're going to come back to Yellowhammer in a minute.
Well, in the short term, public disorder, medicine shortages and an increase in food prices. And if you're willing to say boo to a goose when the consequences are this catastrophic, what is the point of running to be mayor?
I mean, we've seen a number of Conservative members expelled from the Conservative Party in Parliament, and we've seen some of them standing up and being counted and leaving the cabinet. And I think that's been very brave and very welcome. Some of them are people who support Brexit, but they don't support a no-deal Brexit because of the likely impact. Do you think that a no-deal Brexit is going to increase the cost of living in Londoners? Cost of living in London for Londoners?
Well, look, we already know. You mentioned in your first question the importance of the currency markets. If the pound goes down versus the euro or the dollar, and bearing in mind we import so much stuff from these countries, 40% of our food comes from the EU, it's hardly surprising to expect the price of foods to go up. And what the Yellowhammer document shows is the people who would suffer the most from the increase in food prices are the poorest Londoners. And that's why sensible people understand the consequences of a no-deal Brexit are campaigning, lobbying, changing the law to make sure it doesn't happen, and even jeopardising their personal careers. Some of these people, by the way, who are friends of mine, Conservative MPs, have dreamed of being MPs, love being Conservative MPs, and are giving up that career and the job they love because they think the national interest trumps party political interest and certainly trump Boris Johnson's interest.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor.
Assembly Member Dismore.
Mr Mayor, what would be the impact on London's economy of increasing the salary threshold for overseas workers coming here to £36,700, as proposed by the new Conservative Home Secretary Priti Patel?
It's economic madness. Look, at the moment, using the £30,000 figure that was previously published by the previous Home Secretary, so £30,000, half of Londoners, earn less than £30,000. And when you bear in mind that many of those are EU citizens, that means they would not be eligible using that £30,000 threshold. If you increase that to £37,000, it means even fewer Londoners earn that sums of money. So if you are somebody who we need from the EU, a nurse, social care worker, somebody in construction, somebody in hospitality, you simply won't be able to come here. Economy will suffer, jobs will go down, and it doesn't do our city or country any good whatsoever.
Yeah, well, I assume, therefore, you agree that there's a significant risk to London's services and the economy if we can't recruit the skilled workers we need, whose incomes don't meet the Conservatives' threshold. For example, those in social care and the NHS, a junior doctor would start on £35,750 below the threshold, a nurse on £21,347 below the threshold. And London already has the highest vacancy rate in the country for the NHS at 14%, with over 9,000 posts unfilled. And 51% of the EU nurses and midwives who left the register post-Brexit gave that as the reason why they were leaving the NHS and going elsewhere. So what would you say to those, such as one Assembly member, who said that the poorest Londoners suffer as a result of immigration because foreign citizens compete with Londoners for jobs, that being Assembly Member Bailey?
Can I come in here, Mr Mayor? The questions from Assembly members to you are not about the behaviours or comments made by other Assembly members. It's about your positioning. And so I'm going to stop this here because we're getting into dangerous territory here with known candidates for the mayoralty sitting around this table. So I would like... No, can I just finish? And I am going to rule, and I'm going to say, Mr Mayor, can you focus your responses to your responsibilities and your opinions, please? Yes, you have a point of order.
We are aware of those issues and the Chair's rulings in the past, and we've challenged and we've supported those rulings. We're not naming individuals, but it's right to challenge the views of others in this chamber. And it's right for the Mayor to counteract those views if he disagrees with those. We on this side will continue to ask questions. We will respectfully try to work within your guidelines around that, but we're not going to be constrained by that. If members on the opposite side say statements that are actually causing great damage to Londoners, then we on this side will continue to raise these points in the way that we will raise them within your guidelines, but we are working within those guidelines.
And I'll come back to you and say, and I shall be very carefully listening to what's been said and done. And at this moment, I am just saying to the Mayor that I would ask him to consider answering questions from Assembly members about his responsibilities and about his opinions on the questions being put.
Further to that point of order, Madam Chair, I'm happy to withdraw the name of Assembly Member Bailey from the question I put, but the issue raised still stands.
Thank you. That's better.
Well, Chair, can I just say I'm also happy not to mention that these comments were made by Senator Bailey. I'm also happy, Chair. I'm also happy. I'm happy, Chair.
Absolutely.
No, do you know, we were just going so well.
Sure,
so,
okay.
So let's start again.
Well, let me rephrase. Let me answer the question by saying, Chair,
Yeah.
I would be very surprised.
In order,
I would be,
we'll get on.
Chair, I'd be surprised and disappointed if somebody elected to this Assembly thought that poorest Londoners suffer as a result of immigration.
Thank you.
Because foreign citizens compete with Londoners for jobs, homes and healthcare. But if anybody says that and wants to be mayor, he ain't going to win in this city.
Thank you. Okay, Assembly Member Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mayor, you already mentioned the Cabinet Office report, Operation Yellow Hammer. Do you think it is sheer scaremongering, or does the report have any substance? And following that, do you think London is ready to face the shortages and chaos it will result in? And what steps are you able to take to protect Londoners from acute shortages and disastrous impact it will have on economic development of London?
These are three really important issues raised in one question. Firstly, can I just say this? Look, we know from the government's own document published last night in full, save for one paragraph, and published in the Sunday Times 3 weeks ago by Rosamund Irwin, that the government's own assessment, whether it's a base assessment or a reasonable worst assessment, shows in the short term there could be public disorder, there could be a shortage of medicines, and food prices could go up. But also, having to reduce tariffs and imports of petrol could lead to jobs being lost and disorder. This side say I shouldn't be talking about Brexit or doing any work on Brexit. If I listen to this side, I'd be doing nothing whatsoever to address the challenges facing our city. Fortunately, this mayor doesn't listen to this side because they talk rubbish a lot of the time. So, since last summer, we've been working assiduously on the London Resilience Forum, getting ready for preparation for the possibility of leaving the EU, including on the 1st and the 31st of November at 11 p.m. And that means with Fiona Twycross chairing the police, emergency services, the NHS, utilities, other experts to make sure we're as ready as we can be for a no-deal Brexit. And what the documents published from the government show is there are reasons we should be concerned. Put aside the long-term loss of growth, jobs and prosperity for our city, but in the short term as well. Now, I'm being heckled by the Conservatives, so they want to shut down Parliament, and now they want to shut me up as well. I'm not going to let them. I'm not going to let them.
Nothing constructive to
because, and we know why they want to shut us down, because they're scared about scrutiny, they're scared about being checked and balanced. And here we go. So being heckled by Conservatives for pointing out to London the risks of a no-deal Brexit. But you're right to be concerned. And what we're doing from City Hall, over the objections of the Conservatives, is getting as ready as we can for a no-deal Brexit, which could happen at 11 p.m. on the 31st of October.
Mr. Mayor, we had a lot of information on this report out in public domain when it was leaked. But what is more worrying, having looked at the details from that 2nd of August report, the specific worry related to medicines is the shortage that it will have, and particularly there's reference to social care, which will have severe impact both in London and right across the nation. And there's a specific reference in the report on fuel shortage in London. Are you able to sort of deal with this from your perspective to protect London from this disorder and the bleak scenario that we could or we would potentially face if there was no deal.
One of the things that I'll be asking Michael Gove when I meet him next week is to release to us the information upon which the assessment's based, and that's really, really important. But the chair of the BMA and others have expressed real concern about not just the NHS directly, but social care as well. And these guys will heckle and moan and complain, and what they should be doing is addressing the concerns people have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Standing Orders 4.4 gives a member who's been named the right of personal explanation. Any member name, especially you, Assembly Member, Assembly Member Bailey, do you want your right to give a personal explanation?
Aware of Standing Order 4.4.
I'm glad you are.
And when my time, I feel like I need to represent myself, I'll do so.
No, he's too scared. He's frit. He's a wuss.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor. No.
He's wrapped in cotton wool.
No.
Come on, Sean, say something. Come on, Sean, say something.
Okay, I'll tell you what I say.
Yeah, come on.
We are all in here trying to conduct our business, working for Londoners, and you've taken every opportunity you can to act like a child. Answer the questions, and we can get on with our business. Or you can behave like a child. You talk to us about heckling you, it's because you won't answer the questions. We all know, so does London know, that you are not doing your job. You speak about everything other than what's important to people. So that's what I would say. But Chair, at some point, he's going to have to behave. If he won't behave, why should I?
No.
Oh, it's very good.
I didn't hear anything about your personal position, but that's it. You've been given the
Chair,
opportunity.
please, can he speak longer?
No, Mr. Mayor, no. I want to move on because we just started.
But the more he speaks, the better it's for me.
No. It's fine. Let's move on. The next question is in the name of Assembly
Gareth's
Member
not happy, is
Curtin.
he?
Taxi fleet.
Sean, Gareth's not happy with you, Sean.
Sorry. Just hold on a minute. Assembly Member Cooper, you wanted to come back.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's still on the subject of Brexit, and it's about the and it's about...
Can I just say, don't allow the Tories heckling you to put you off raising the important issues.
I won't. It's a very serious question about things that the Mayor has been doing. And the impact on Londoners who may need to seek settled or pre-settled status. The figures nationally show that only 1 million of the 3 million people affected and who need to apply have applied. Is that proportion the same in London? Do we know?
Well, can I just say, I mean, your question highlights why this issue is so important to our friends, family and neighbours. What the current Home Secretary and Prime Minister have said is that the free movement of people will end once we leave the EU without a deal on the 31st of October. Now, these guys may not want to talk about it, but it's important. Because if free movement ends, the right of a Londoner, and they're Londoners, by the way, to leave the UK and then come back could be made more difficult. It could make it more difficult to reunite families. It could make it more difficult for employers to recruit people from the EU. And that's why it's so important. Let me tell you the really shocking figure. The government doesn't even know how many people in London have applied and registered for secured status. What they tell us, what we know from the government is, roughly speaking, of the 3.3 million people in the country, about 1 million have registered. Now, just do the maths. If in London there are 1 million EU citizens, Londoners by the way, and 10% don't register, that's 100,000 Londoners. And that's why, rather than shutting us up, as these guys want to do, we should be talking about it and shouting about it from the rooftops. The good news is, on the 21st of September, despite protests from these guys, I'll be opening up City Hall, having lawyers present here, advisors present here, to give advice to Londoners who are EU citizens, how they can make sure their rights are stabilised and made secure.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that because, like many Londoners, my family came here and at one point my grandmother had problems getting back into the country in a certain situation and was helped by her Labour MP. And I noticed that one of the things that was very helpful is setting up the EU portal. Now, we had some disgraceful statements from the current Home Secretary in early August where she said that immediately free movement would end. I've no idea how she thought this would ever happen. It was a grossly misleading statement. She's been forced to row back from that appalling comment. Was there a spike in portal access round about the time that Patel said those things?
Well, we've seen good use of the portal throughout the time. So the e-portal is doing good work. and people will carry on using the portal. We've also got the 21st September event. What you're seeing is, I'm afraid, also a potential spike in hate crime. We've seen some examples of hate crime, so we've got to be a bit careful with language, and that's why Senator Dismal was right to call out what some people are saying about the impact on people here who have been here for a while by immigrants / EU citizens.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor, and thank you for being here to answer our questions, unlike Parliament and unlike people who shut themselves up.
Assembly Member Curtin, answer his question on taxi fleet.
Thank you, Chair.
Oh, a real question.
We've got a coalition here. The Brexit Party and the Tories have already formed. Forget Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. London's iconic taxis are an important part of our heritage and provide a vital service to people across the city. However, neither TfL nor I have control over the number of licences applied for. I've made my support for the taxi trade and its place in London's transport network very clear. Both my transport strategy and my comprehensive taxi and private hire action plans show this support. For example, TfL is investing £600,000 to increase the number of taxi ranks across the capital. Since 2016, we've already created an additional 77 taxi ranks. TfL has introduced mandatory card and contactless payment and enabled taxis to access 18 additional bus lanes on the road network. These initiatives have made customer journey quicker and more convenient. TfL is promoting the benefits of being a London taxi driver to those looking for a new career by raising the profile of the knowledge of London. Recently, TfL officers discussed the knowledge on a podcast run by the LTDA. And after listening to the views of the taxi trade in the recent Tooley Street consultation, TfL confirmed that black cab drivers will continue to be able to access the road from Borough High Street. At the same time, tackling London's air pollution is a public health priority. Taxis have an important role to play in combating poor air quality and protecting Londoners' health. That's why I provided significant funding and financial incentives to the trade. I've created a £42 million fund which offers payment of up to £10,000 for taxi owners who choose to retire their older, more polluting vehicle. £5 million of this is available to help eligible taxi owners convert to a liquid petroleum gas system. I continue to contribute a grant offering £7,500 off the purchase of a zero-emission capable taxi. To support uptake of greener vehicles, TfL is investing £18 million to deliver a rapid charging network across the capital. TfL already has more than 200 charging points, 73 of which dedicated to taxis, and London now has over 2,100 zero-emission capable taxis licensed, and I'm delighted that the first pure electric taxi, the Dynamo, has just been licensed by TfL, providing taxi drivers with a choice of 2 ZEC taxis.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Mr. Mayor. And I would like to say thank you, first of all, because one of the things I've asked you about a lot is continuing to allow taxis to go along Tooley Street and Duke Hill Road. And you've listened to me, you've listened to the consultation, so thank you for acting on behalf of taxis on that small point. But my question was, what are you going to do to stop the reduction in the size of the taxi fleet? Because since you became mayor in 2016, the taxi fleet has gone down from 21,759 to 19,122 today. So there's over 2,600 taxis have left the fleet. And the number of taxi drivers has gone down by more than that, by nearly 3,000. So the size is reducing dramatically, whether that's by design or by unintended consequences. You've mentioned some things here, but one of the biggest things that taxi drivers are concerned about is your recent announcement that you're going to reduce the maximum age of a taxi licence from 15 years to 12 years. That will reduce the size of the fleet even more. We had a motion last week in the Assembly asking for you to reconsider. Will you reconsider that point?
Well, let me unpack the 2-minute question, Chair, and deal with the various points. So the numbers of vehicles and drivers has been going down since 2009-2010. It didn't begin in May 2016. And so in 2009-2010, 22,500 vehicles, 25,000 drivers. So the dip didn't begin in May 2016. And a number of reasons which you're well aware of for the reduction since 2009 and 2010. Increased competition from private hire vehicles. The general macroeconomic factors resulted in reduced public spend on taxis, as well as more taxis being decommissioned, as you've referred to in the end of your question. The increased compensation we're giving makes it more attractive for taxi drivers to do so. We should be proud of the fact we have more than 2,000 now zero-emission capable taxis, proud of the fact that rather than taxis contributing more and more toxic stuff to the air, they're now taking steps to address that. But you're right, there are challenges in relation to the numbers of new people doing the knowledge, the numbers of new people applying for licences, and that's why TfL are working with those who want to be black cab drivers to make it easier to do so, but also to raise awareness of it.
You've just given a figure in your answer there. I mean, you've said that the taxi fleet was 22,500 in 2010, and therefore it's been going down since then. But I mean, you're looking at those numbers, that means in 6 years, from 2010 to 2016, it's gone down by about, 741. But in the 3.5 years since you've been mayor, it's gone down by 2,637. I mean, that is over 3 times as much in your tenure. So you have to be responsible for the reduction in the fleet while you've been the mayor. And it's going down at a rate that is unprecedented. So some of the things you've said there are fine, but it hasn't had any effect on stopping the hemorrhaging of the numbers of taxis. What would you like to see the taxi fleet be by the time you finish your term here in May 2020? Would you like to see numbers go up again?
Well, again, you refer to vehicles, not drivers. There are more and more drivers sharing vehicles now, which wasn't the case before. Often you'd have a driver with one vehicle, now you've got 2 drivers, sometimes 3 drivers sharing a vehicle, and also the phenomenon of renting vehicles as well. I'm quite clear, and I've examined the policies of the first mayor and the second mayor, and we have the most pro-black taxi policies of all 3 mayors, and I include me as the 3rd mayor, and I'm happy to be examined by the previous 2 mayors. And so we're doing what we can to try and help the black taxi trade, but it is a fact. In the last 8 years before I became mayor, the numbers of private vehicles doubled almost. You know this because you've talked about it in the past before.
Indeed,
you can't have selective amnesia and pretend there was a great time between 2008 and 2016 and suddenly things have gone bad since 2016. We're doing all the things we said we'd do in our action plan. The more bus lanes can be used, increased marshalling, making sure we tackle those who are applying for hire illegally, making sure we financially assist the black taxi trade. By the way, I'm criticised by private hire vehicles for subsidising the black taxi trade and criticised by you
Mr. Mayor,
for not doing enough.
You have a big decision to make this month, which is to whether to relicense Uber or not. And that's going to have a big effect on the size of the private hire vehicle part of the trade. And if you don't relicense Uber because you think it's not fit and proper, because they haven't fulfilled all the conditions in the probationary 15-month licence that you've given, that will help the taxi trade. What is your position on that, or are you not ready to make an announcement on it yet?
Well, Chair, as much as the Summer wants me to break the law and as a regulator and licensor announce to the
Assembly... I was asking you if you were ready to make an announcement or not. Obviously, from your that comment, you're not ready to make an announcement. So, unfortunately, I've run out of time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mayor, I'm delighted that you believe yourself to be the most pro-black taxi mayor of all. You obviously don't look at your Twitter. In your manifesto, Mr. Mayor, you promised, let me just have a look at the manifesto here, special privileges will be built in, as they've always been, for those who become licensed London taxi drivers. You also actually mentioned retaining the exclusive right of licensed black taxi drivers to use bus lanes and apply for hire. So you promised special privileges to the black cab drivers. Could you, I've listened very carefully to what you've said. I haven't heard any, but perhaps you could give us some of those special privileges, Mr. Mayor, that you've introduced.
I think I'm happy to reread the answer I gave to Senator Curtin in relation to the special privileges we've given. Let me give you some of them. Let me give you some of the special privileges. 18 additional bus lanes can be used by black taxis. That's a privilege nobody else says for buses. I'll give you another one. Give financial assistance to black taxis to scrap their vehicles. Nobody gets that level of assistance besides black taxis.
Not a privilege.
Privilege.
It's not a privilege.
I'm sorry. If vehicle A gets a big sum of money to scrapping their vehicles and other vehicles don't, that's a privilege vehicle A has and other vehicles don't. Another privilege I can give, Chair, is the privilege of an additional grant towards buying a zero-emission cable taxi. Again, privilege not giving that sort of sum to any other vehicle purchaser. You speak to an electrician who's loved and would die to have a zero-emission van, doesn't get the same sort of privilege
They haven't
a
got a
black
choice.
tax.
They've got to buy it. It's not a privilege. They've got to buy it. It's not a privilege.
I'm sorry, being given a grant.
Oh, you should be sorry.
towards,
I agree with you.
towards,
You should be sorry.
Well,
So, shall I give you an idea of what your...
I mean, we've got on the one hand, we've got on the one hand complaints about schoolboy politics. On the other hand, a grown man playing schoolboy politics.
Well, you're giving the example.
This must have looked really good when you were rehearsing this morning.
Do you think that your
Not so good in the
privileges
Assembly.
include, Mr Mayor, reducing the working age of older cabs, thus destroying older drivers' retirement plan? Is that a privilege?
So here's a
Relicensing PHV companies who are still flaunting the rules? Is that a privilege? Stopping cabs from using bus lanes? Should it not be where buses go, taxis go? Is that not a privilege? Not acknowledging black cabs as part of the transport network? Is that a privilege? Not giving black cab drivers the choice of 5 electric cabs to choose from as you promised, thus forcing them to buy, with of course the privilege of your subsidy, an expensive cab from a monopoly supplier. Admittedly, there is now one more, but that's not 5, Mr Mayor. Not providing enough electric charging points, so that the fact is most electric cabs are running on their petrol range extenders the bulk of the time. And, of course, tripling the reduction of the fleet we've just heard today. Are those some of the special privileges that you promised, Mr Mayor?
Chair, can I have some guidance? The question was 2.5 minutes. How long should my answer be?
Well, just let's go. See
Okay.
how let's hear it.
Right, so I think it's a human right, not a privilege, to breathe clean air. And we have in London an invisible killer, which is the toxic air. And half of this toxic air comes from transport. Nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter and nitrogen oxide. To me, it's not a privilege to breathe clean air, it's a human right. Now, one of the ways we're going to have this human right protected in London is by tackling those vehicles that are emitting nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter. And that's why we've introduced this year in London, despite opposition from the Conservatives, the world's first ultra-low emission zone. Now, that's seen progress already cleaning up the air. In the first monitoring, 20% less toxic air in those parts of London which have the ULEZ. But here's the point. We know that taxis contribute a disproportionate amount of nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter. And that's why we've got to clean up our taxis. So even though the ULEZ will lead to other vehicles being less polluting, they will take no action in relation to black taxis. And that's where the bold plans we're talking about come in. So black taxis get a privilege, other vehicles don't, which is a huge subsidy towards scrapping a polluting diesel vehicle. And they receive a privilege which other new purchasers don't receive, which is a grant towards buying a zero-emission vehicle. But the other point of this investment in clean air is the cost to the NHS is much less. We spend billions of pounds helping people with asthma, with stunted lungs, with heart disease, with cancer caused by the poor quality air. But also, I think it's unacceptable for somebody who is polluting not to pay towards the cost of doing that. So on the one hand, I'm supporting black taxis by making sure they can pay contactless, use contactless in their cab, more bus lanes for them to use, listening to consultations, giving them financial support, making sure the taxis are built in the country, advertising and publicising the knowledge, having more enforcement officers take action against private vehicles, applying fire, acting illegally. On the other hand, cleaning up the air in London. And by the way, who suffers the worst air in London? Black taxi drivers. So they all benefit from some of our policies. He can call it a privilege, I call it human right.
Thank you for that answer. Let's go then to anybody else? No. Let's go to the next question, and that's in the name of Assembly Member Prince. And this is about Gants Hill Library.
Thank you, Chair. Libraries across London play a hugely important role in local communities, offering places to meet, learn and connect, often supporting some of our most vulnerable Londoners. Local authorities have a statutory duty to provide a library service. It's a matter for each authority to decide how this is delivered. However, achieving this has been made hugely challenging due to swinging cuts to councils' funding. The government has reduced funding by close to 60% since 2010. Rob Whiteman, the CEO of CIPFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accounting, recently said libraries are, and I quote, a canary in the coal mine for what is happening across the local government sector, and I quote, a lack of funds is forcing many councils to be creative in how they deliver their services. Just under 1,000 of the country's public libraries have been closed since 2010. Despite this, the London Borough of Redbridge has pledged to retain all 12 libraries in the borough. With such severe government cuts, innovation and modernisation is vital to ensure residents have access to libraries in the future. It's worth reminding the Assembly that Redbridge Council is keeping more of its libraries open than its neighbouring Havering Council, and Redbridge hasn't closed a single library despite government cuts. I'm assured by Redbridge that Gants Hill Library will not close. It will become part of a community hub, bringing library services alongside other council services under one roof and benefiting many more people. The local community is actively involved in the hub. The City Hall Social Integration Design Lab is providing support for the new space, as well as 4 other community hubs in Redbridge. My Good Growth Fund has awarded £51 million since 2016 and is recently reopened, making a further £20 million of funding available, and I've already funded 2 projects which support the development and innovation of additional services linked to libraries through my Good Growth Fund. Any council is welcome to contact my team, who provide support and advice to all Good Growth Fund applicants in developing their proposals. While libraries play an important community role, they're also an economic enabler. Earlier this week, working with the British Library, we launched Startups in London Libraries, which supports aspiring and early-stage entrepreneurs across 10 London boroughs. I remain committed to supporting them innovate and deliver for their communities.
Assembly Prince.
Thank you for that, Mr Mayor. It's very helpful. Would you agree, Mr Mayor, that when a politician makes a promise, he or she should keep it?
Oh, absolutely. Are you talking about the Prime Minister?
Thank you. So, could I ask you, Mr Mayor, I mean, I know you're very friendly with Councillor Atwell, and that's a good thing. Could I ask you to encourage him to keep the promise that he made to the people of Redbridge, that when he did the consultation on the library, one of the options would be that the library be kept as it currently is. The consultation that's out at the moment doesn't give people the option to retain the library as it is. It talks about all the good things that the hub may provide, and I'm not against the hub. I'm just saying that the people were promised that there would be a choice of either having the hub and the extra 100 apartments and the other facilities that that might provide, or keeping the library and the car park. That is not in the consultation. So I'm asking you, Mr Mayor, if you would use your good offices to have a friendly word with your friend Councillor Atwell to see if they would redo the consultation, but include in that consultation a real choice of either keeping the 1930s library and the car park or going for the offer that is the hub.
Well, Chair, I mean, the Council's consulting on its plans, but as I've explained, the economic context is one they've got to take into account. One of the things I'd hope they would do is make sure that the offer local residents receive is better after the plans are developed rather than less good. But I understand libraries are crucial lifelines for many, particularly poorer people who haven't got space in their homes for books and all the rest of it. And so it's really important that there is an improved offer if possible. I hope any consultation is meaningful and genuine, and I'm positive that this very good council leader will make sure he listens to his constituents. I also am aware that the excellent local MP West Streeton is also working with the council to make sure residents have their views heard, and I'm sure working together they can get the best deal for local residents in the context of the massive cuts since 2010.
So the question I'll put to you again, Mr Mayor, is will you speak to Councillor Atwell and ask him to redo the consultation with an option to retain the library, so that we have a genuine consultation? Yeah. I'm not saying we should keep the library, I'm not saying we shouldn't do the hub, I'm just asking for a genuine consultation that gives people a choice. Let
me be clear, Chair. It's my fault, I didn't hear properly the question. I have no intention of asking the council leader to redo the consultation. I think it's really important that consultation is done properly. I hope it is done properly the first time around. What I'd recommend to the Assembly member is to respond to the consultation to make sure he has his views heard by the council and tries to influence the consultation. And while he's at it, can he also speak to Havering, where there are fewer libraries than there are in Redbridge?
So what you're saying is that you will not lend your support to the people of Redbridge to get a genuine consultation. That's your answer, Mr Mayor. I'm
saying it's very important, Chair, for the people of Redbridge and neighbouring boroughs who use the library to respond to the consultation. It's really important for them to be aware about some of the tough choices made by good councils in the context of 60% cuts since 2010. I'm really reassured by the fact no library has been closed despite massive cuts from central government. I'm reassured by the fact that SIP for a sane local authorities have got to be creative when it comes to keeping libraries open. But also, as I've announced in my answer, original answer, from City Hall we're trying to help libraries do even more by having facilities for entrepreneurs to be in libraries, to start up businesses. That will be another service libraries can offer us, which provides a revenue stream and support for libraries to be even more successful going forward.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The answer is no. Thank you. There are residents, you've heard it. Thank you.
Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Mayor, sorry, I didn't quite catch the last bit you said. Could you remind us what's happened to local authority budgets since 2010 under successive Conservative governments?
I mean, Senator Prince now coughs when you ask your question. For those who didn't hear it because of the cough from Senator Prince, since 2010...
We're all going to get a cold from
since 2010, councils across the country have lost 60% of monies they receive from central government. We are a centralised democracy, and because they've lost so much money from central government, they're making tough choices. But great councils are making those tough choices and being creative in finding solutions. But the responsibility for these cuts lies at the top in central government. And I'd remind colleagues, there is somebody around this room who was an advisor in number 10 when these cuts were being made. And so he'll be able to explain why those cuts were made in 2010. It wasn't me, by the way, Chair.
So, well, help me out here, Mr Mayor. Do you think it's possible that there is a link between library closures in London and the cuts inflicted on local authorities in London by the government since 2010?
Well, I've been saying for some time now, cuts have consequences, and I think the premise of your question is a good one, which is there is a link between the cuts made by this government consistently since 2010 and the consequences that people see on the ground with, for example, libraries having consultation about their future.
And do you think, therefore, it might be a better use of GLA Conservatives' time to lobby their own government ministers to reverse these cuts? Well,
the point I'd make is if you aren't willing, as a member of the Assembly, to stand up for Londoners against Boris Johnson and this government, you don't deserve to be a member of the Assembly, let alone run to be the Mayor.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor.
Okay. Next question is in the name of Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the question. My Vision Zero approach means that TfL and I are exploring all opportunities to minimise danger for people using the capital streets. I'm concerned about the potential for any distraction to motorists, especially if it may impair their ability to drive safely, which can put them and other road users at risk. The law currently only prohibits using a handheld mobile phone or other device while driving. A hands-free device can be used lawfully. However, we must be aware that this does not mean there's no potential for distraction from hands-free mobile phone use. There is some evidence to suggest that holding a conversation on a mobile phone, even if it's hands-free, can distract and impair a driver's ability to react. For this reason, the Met and City of London Police enforce against any driving behaviour that is deemed to be dangerous or careless, including if this is a result of using a hands-free mobile phone. A police officer has to use their judgment in determining whether an instance of interacting with a mobile phone is considered to be careless. While it's not possible to isolate offences caused by hands-free mobile phone use, in 2017-18, the police made 2,259 traffic offence reports, fixed penalty notices, or arrests for driving without due care and attention. This is in addition to a further 10,778 for handheld phone use. The recent Transport Select Committee inquiry into driving while using a mobile phone recommended that government should explore options for extending the ban on driving while using handheld devices to include hand-free devices. I support the recommendation that government should look into this issue further, and it's my view that this should include drivers' use of cradled hands-free mobile phones for use other than telephone calls. I'll ask the TfL officials to make themselves available to support this work. There are practical challenges to the enforcement of a law that includes hands-free mobile phone use. These should be explored and discussed at a national level through appropriate consultation.
Thank you for your answer, and I welcome the recent Transport Select Committee's report on the use of mobile phones and, as you say, calling for tougher restrictions on drivers using mobile phones, including looking at the case for extending the ban to hands-free devices. My questions today relate to the private hire and taxi industry. Over 2 years ago, I asked you about this, and you stated that TfL is exploring the available technology that could limit the use of electronic devices and mobile phones while driving a vehicle that is moving. I'm wondering, what is the outcome of that work?
They have. Can I just put on record, Chair, the Assembly member has been assiduous on this issue. She raised it most recently earlier this year as well. So I'm happy for them to brief the Assembly member in relation to the progress made. There's been some work taking place. It is cutting-edge stuff, but I'm happy for her to be briefed personally about the work they've done. We're not quite ready to roll it out. We're going to work with the police in relation to enforcement. There are challenges in relation to enforcement, but I'm more than happy for her to be briefed in relation to this, but we aren't quite ready to use that. The issue is of a driver being distracted by the various devices on his or her screen and leading to, without driving with due care and attention.
As you say, this, I mean, it is a serious safety issue, and it fits in with your Vision Zero. So what I really want to understand is, what are you doing to ensure there are some sort of limiters in place so that no driver can interact with their mobile phone whilst they're driving?
Yeah, the blocking technology is not there to be used yet. And so the concern is that whilst driving, you're touching and playing with the device on the screen. And that's what we discussed at the previous exchange, which TfL are looking into what steps can be taken to use technology to, inverted commas, jam these devices. They're not there yet, and there are concerns about use. But again, I'm really happy for her to be reassured by the briefing in relation to the work we're doing. We haven't fallen asleep on the job. We do take it seriously, but it is difficult stuff.
Okay, thank you. I'll take your offer up on that briefing. Private hire drivers are under immense pressure to read and to immediately respond to booking requests being sent to them whilst they are driving other passengers. TfL's latest statistics show that there's a large number of people slightly injured using minicabs and taxis every year, but the data is not broken down by company or by type of vehicle. I'm wondering whether breaking down this data would help TfL in making a decision perhaps on whether a company should have their licence renewed or who is a fit and proper operator. So I'm wondering whether you'd ask TfL to provide greater detail in these statistics and to perhaps use that as part of the licensing process.
I mean, one of the challenges is the data comes to TfL from the police, and you'll be aware, speaking to Dr. Cinema, of the progress made sometimes by these questions about the police can now disentangle black taxi cabs and private mini hire vehicles. That's progress. You'll remember when we first spoke, whenever years ago, that wasn't happening. I've got to be honest, Chair, what I don't want to do is, without seeing the evidence, add additional bureaucracy on police officers who are making these stops. The key thing is to make sure somebody's driving without due care and attention be properly penalised. Question what more data could they get from the individual driver, individual operator, etc. I'm not sure about. I can look into this. But the other point is there are some drivers who drive for more than one operator. And so I can just foresee, just talking to you, some challenges. But I'm happy to take it away and see how realistic it is. But what I don't want to do is put additional, inverted commas, red tape on police officers who have, are dealing with the real mischief, which is driving without due care and attention.
I appreciate that, but I just think if there's a way to capture that data, then it might point that there's a particular company that there needs to be a focus on safety and driver training.
But also there are perverse incentives, and that's why it's useful as well. Some operators may be having a perverse incentive to respond quickly, which can lead to... I get the point. I'll look into it and see what we can do, yeah.
I really welcome that. There was a Times article a few weeks ago, and if you describe that, a reporter going undercover as a driver for Uber, and how they describe the constant phone beeping as they're driving passengers, I just think there's a real worry that could add to danger on our streets, and I would appreciate some action on that. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Okay, thank you. And we go on to the next question, which is in the name of Assembly Member Duval. Deadline for fixing ACM cladding.
Thank you, Chair. More than 2 years on from the tragedy at Grenfell Tower, the government's delays, failures and broken promises, both in helping those directly affected and in making buildings across the country safe, have been appalling. After 2 years of pressure, the government finally made some funding available to remove and replace unsafe ACM cladding from high-rise buildings, but I've said repeatedly that funding should be available to cover all types of unsafe cladding and the cost of interim fire safety measures too, not just specific type of unsafe cladding. The GLA's role in these programmes is purely administrative. We'll continue to work with councils, housing associations and campaigners to put pressure on the government to make sure this funding is put into use quickly and effectively. Removing and replacing unsafe cladding of all types and protecting leaseholders from the costs should be an urgent priority for the government. Before the summer recess, the outgoing Secretary of State said that the remediation of all buildings with ACM would be complete by June 2020. This remark was unrealistic and irresponsible, particularly in light of the government's approach to Brexit. The pace of building remediation across both sectors is reliant on access to trained workers and materials. I've highlighted many times the crucial role European workers play in the construction workforce, including scaffolders and cladders, What's more, I also understand that much of the replacement cladding we need is imported into the UK. The previous Secretary of State's deadline looks set to be yet another broken promise from the government on building safety. You're absolutely right to highlight the risk of a chaotic no-deal Brexit. No-deal Brexit must be avoided for the safety of Londoners, and as I've said before, the Prime Minister must urgently revoke Article 50 and give the British public the final say.
We've just not got the problem with no-deal Brexit, but also about the length of time it's taking. There's some outstanding research that's been done for highlight just one aspect of the cladding issues, but there's other cladding under testing. But can we just go back? The London Fire Brigade recently emphasised the need for a risk-based approach on other issues. The government fund only considers buildings over 18 metres. We really ought to be looking at what the fire brigades say are our care homes and other buildings, schools in particular. Do you think there is a pressing need to discover the extent of other dangerous cladding or fire risks on these buildings?
Absolutely, and I met the Commissioner yesterday, and she is really worried about the government's failure to address the issue of care homes and schools. We appear to have a two-tier system. We're just going on height, important though it is. I'll give you an example. Samuel Garside housing in Barking, Senator Boff, who lives in that area, knows it very well. He was there on the night of the fire. This is a four-storey building where this fire spread quickly, not covered by the government's proposals, not covered by remediation. We had a fire last week in Sutton, and that fire spread in minutes as well. Not ACM cladding, not necessarily a cladding issue. We're looking at the investigation. So imagine if there were care homes, though. In the middle of the night, can you imagine evacuating a care home with that sort of speed? So the Commissioner is extremely worried. She's been lobbying the government. I've been lobbying the government. And I'm concerned about the lack of response from the government on this issue.
Can we write to our colleagues in I know you're constantly talking to colleagues in local government. Can we try and widen out the pressure on government about that, but just seeing to the extent of what their research may have uncovered and may well not be public available, and maybe it should or it shouldn't. I think it should. But, you know, in terms that we've got sufficient plans in terms to protect those issues, particularly around care homes, I think it's quite worrying.
So thanks for that. I mean, so on the day of the Sutton fire, I put in a call to Robert Jenrick, the new Secretary of State for MHCLG, and I was impressed with his response. We spoke on the day. The Commissioner was on the line and her top team, as indeed was the Secretary of State's top team. We agreed to take some steps to address the issue you've raised, and I'll be writing to him to make some further points. But the speed of his response, and he seemed well briefed with the issues, I think we can now start to make some progress, but, you know, watch this space.
And isn't the worry, Mayor, in the sense that the testing that's going on that needs to be done are not just on the aluminium cladding materials, but also other materials, is still not there for the construction industry, others in local government, planning officers to consider and take the appropriate steps? Do you think we potentially could be facing, considering you've mentioned other fires that weren't around cladding issues, but about design, cavity fillers and the rest of it, do you think we could be looking at a much wider list once we get through the Grenfell list, if I can call it that, Grenfell list?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. And that's one of the things that worries the Commissioner and worries her team and worries me. We simply can't answer how many of our buildings are safe and unsafe. We simply can't answer what happens to some of our buildings if there was a fire. Put aside ACM cladding, put aside above 18 metres. Even buildings without ACM cladding, buildings less than 18 metres, hand on heart, no one can say they're all safe.
I'm grateful for Assembly Member Andrew Dismore in terms of his earlier question and others around this table. It's not just an issue for my party group. I think some of these sentiments are shared by others on the other side of this issue. But the issue is, I think what we need to do as an Assembly, Mr Mayor, what could we do to help you in terms of getting the government to speed up some of their actions so we can get ahead of the game rather than being at the back of it? We know Brexit will cause problems in terms of some of the manufacturing, some of the supply labours, but in terms of just getting to grips with this issue and making sure that we minimise any future losses of life or any risk to people as possible.
Yeah, the key thing, Chair, is what we shouldn't be having is an argy-bargy argument between leaseholders and the building owner, tenants and the council, care home users and those that run the care home. What I think would be sensible, Chair, is if the government was to remediate and repair and make safe those buildings that need making safe, and then later on the government can get the compensation and monies back from the building owners and stuff. There's a first issue, which is identifying which buildings are at risk. The Commission's already identified some of our concerns. You've mentioned them, care homes, in particular schools, in particular, at those buildings above a certain level, and we need some expediency from central government in relation to addressing this.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question in the name of Assembly Member Bacon.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question. Londoners desperately need more affordable houses. That's why I've made building more council, social rented and other genuinely affordable homes a top priority. And the record shows that our approach is working. Last year we started 14,544 affordable homes in London, more than in any year since City Hall took control of housing investment. Through building council homes for Londoners, the first ever City Hall programme dedicated to council home building, we also helped councils to get 1,916 new council homes underway, more than in any year since 1985. More widely, my new approach to affordable housing requirements in planning policy has dramatically boosted the level of affordable housing in new planning permissions, while giving home builders much more needed certainty in the planning process. The success of this approach is clear. Towards the end of the previous Mayor's time in office, even using his dodgy definition, affordable housing fell to just 13% of new homes being given planning permission. A recent Grant Thornton report found that the level of affordable housing in planning permissions had risen to 36% in 2018. In 2017-18, 12,555 affordable houses were started. In 2018-19, 14,544 affordable houses were started. In 2015 and 16, by comparison, under the previous Mayor, just 7,189 were started. And that's even using the previous definition. Since I became Mayor, we've set up the new London Land Fund, a £736 million fund to buy land and support developments that will include high proportions of affordable housing. I've already approved investments to deliver 50% affordable housing at North Middlesex University Hospital, 800 homes with a minimum of 50% affordable at former St Anne's Hospital site, and over 1,000 homes with at least 60% affordable on the former Holloway prison site. We're using all the powers and resources we have to get new homes built in London, and crucially, to put more affordable housing in first. But we urgently need the government to play their part too. The government needs to give us a step change in our powers and investment so that we can truly fix London's housing crisis, and it's essential that we rule out a no-deal Brexit, which would be catastrophic on the home building environment.
Thank you very much for the answer, Mr. Mayor. In July of this year, you announced support for rent control in London and requested the powers to implement it. And in an exchange with my colleague Andrew Boff at your first Mayor's Question Time in May 2016, you said, and I quote, "I have no plans to introduce rent controls nor the powers to do so." What has changed since then?
I still have no powers to do so, and will continue to lobby the government. We have been successful in some lobbying of government in other areas where we were told we had no powers to do so. And so, because of the confidence there, we think we can move the government in relation to rent controls as well.
You said at the time you had no plans to introduce rent controls. Why do you have plans to do so now?
Well, we're working on plans to lobby the government, so the plans we've got now are in early stage. To get those plans into more fruition, we need the government to establish a London Private Rent Commission. And so the New Economics Foundation and City Hall have done some work around how we'd get a route map to get to rent control. And you'll be aware of the progress we've made from banning tenants' agents' fees to Section 21, and we're optimistic that with the right government and the right minister, we can make progress here as well.
And what do you anticipate will be the impact of rent control in London?
The idea would be to reduce the levels of rent private tenants are paying. To give you an idea of the scale of the challenge, the average for obvious reasons, average cost of a one-bedroom home in London is more than the average cost of a three-bedroom home in anywhere the rest of England. So the end result of rent control would be to reduce the cost of rent in London, but it's got to go side by the provision of more housing. You've got to deal with the supply side as well. You can't. There's not just one thing. It's not like bash a mold. You can't just fix one part of the housing market. So we need a new supply of homes, affordable homes. That will take some time to do. Fixing the rental market is part and parcel of that as well. But it's part of a package of measures we need to do. And it's been successive decades of failure in our city.
Are you not concerned that rent control can actually end up leading to higher rents, reduced housing supply and poorer property conditions?
If done wrongly, and if that's the only part of the housing equation it can do, and that's going to be part of a package of measures. And that's one of the reasons why we've not had a big bang approach and published what it should be set in stone. We've deliberately been iterative in relation to how we should get there, listening to developers, listening to the quite new build-to-rent market, listening to those who currently are private tenants, but also landlords as well, but also working with the government.
You're quite fond, I think it's fair to say, of quoting experts. Which experts have you spoken to about this?
And, the New Economics Foundation spoke to numbers around the world. They did desktop research as well. And Deputy Mayor James Murray spoke to a number of experts as well, both in this country and from others who are around the world as well. But I'm happy to send you the New Economics Foundation research they did.
Okay, we can do a swap, because I mean, I've looked this up, and I'll give you a few of the quotes that I've got and a lot more. So in 2017, a study of San Francisco's rent controls concluded that, I'm quoting, rent control reduced rental housing supply by 15%, causing a 5.1% citywide rent increase. In 2018, the Stanford economics professor Rebecca Diamond concluded that rent control decreases affordability, fuels gentrification, and creates negative spillovers on the surrounding neighbourhood. And in 2018, closer to home, the London School of Economics Centre for Analysis and Social Exclusion stated that rent controls lead to a steady decline in both the quality and quantity of private renting. I've actually got 12 pages of quotes like this, which I'll be happy to send to you. In that light, Mr. Mayor, does that cause you any concern?
There's mixed views on all sides. We've also got many people on the other side of the equation as well. That's why I've been quite careful in saying, by itself, rent controls aren't the solution to the housing crisis in our city. It's part of a package of measures. We've got rent control in London already. So the rent control that already exists in London is council housing. We've got rent controls in London already, housing association housing. We've got a form of rent control in London already with the new London living rents. The point is it's got to be part of a package of measures. We've got to increase hugely the supply of housing, and you'll be aware that using the same criteria used by the previous mayor, the estimates are we need 65,000 new homes a year in London. So unless there's a massive increase in supply, rent controls by themselves won't address the overwhelming issue of the lack of homes that Londoners can afford. So it's part of a package of measures, but it's also one of the reasons why we deliberately didn't just get off the shelf a rent control model. We deliberately published the research from the Economics Foundation and have come up with a route map how we get to rent controls in the future.
In 2015, the Housing Committee at the London Assembly commissioned Cambridge University to publish this, which was an investigation of rent control, and it found that any form of rent control would certainly reduce the number of homes in London, in some cases by up to 62% by 2025. That surely must be of concern to you.
Well, that's an argument not to build council homes. That's the argument not to build council homes, and that's one of the reasons why I suspect council homes weren't started when the Prime Minister was the mayor. Look, rent controls is part of a package of measures, so the idea is to reduce the rents in London, bearing in mind that a large proportion of people's disposable income goes on rent. And so I don't apologise for wanting to reduce the rents in London. And that's why we've got to, at the same time as increasing supply of homes, deal with the issue of rent controls in London. One of the reasons why you've got many talented Londoners aged between 30 and 40 leaving London, going to other parts of the country, is their inability to rent in London, let alone rent and save money to buy a home in London. So it's part of a package of measures to address the housing crisis in London.
So under what circumstances would you not introduce rent controls in London if you had the power to do it?
Well, I'd want rent controls introduced at the same time as we start building many more houses, including affordable housing.
At the same time you start building them?
Well, we are starting to build significantly more than before, but nowhere near enough. So we're roughly building on an average year, with with good wins now, about 30,000, 32, 35, 36,000. We need to double that. So if the government was to double the amount of investment we receive, if the government was to give us the powers around, for example, land assembly, CPOs, government to give councils more powers, we could start making real progress on house building. There's no reason at all why the government can't give us the powers now to start doing work on a London private rent commission. The first part of that, I'd remind you, is to get the data in from landlords in relation to rent. Scotland, for example, has a national register in relation to this, so it can be done. And so the first part of the plan is to get that data in, what the landlords are taking in rent, what's happening across London. Some local authorities have the data. They're required to have details of licensed authorities. That's the first part of the moving towards rent controls. Once the data's in, we can then move forward.
So you won't introduce rent controls even if you have the powers to do it unless there's a massive increase in the supply of housing in London?
I don't know. I would introduce rent controls if the government gave me the power to do so. The first part of introducing rent controls is to set up the London Private Rent Commission, and the first thing they would do is get the data in from landlords across London to see what rents are currently being paid. We can then get an idea of what the right level of rents are.
But some of that data is already available, Mr Mayor, isn't it? Because the Office for National Statistics have looked into that, and they have shown that since you had the exchange with Andrew Boff in May of 2016, that the average increase in rents across London has only been 1% per year, despite the fact that inflation has been running at 2.1%.
I think the question demonstrates the ignorance in the area. So the rent control in KNC, the rent increase in KNC is different to the rent increase in Havering. The rent increase in Camden is different to the rent increase in Sutton. So a pan-London figure doesn't really help. Now, it would help if you want to live in a city like Paris, where poorer people live on the outskirts and wealthy people live in London. That's not the city I want to be the mayor of. And so for there to be genuine information about the rents in London, we need proper information from all parts of London, inner, outer, more affluent, less affluent.
So you're not concerned that the opinion of experts from all around the world, which are probably best summed up by the Nobel Prize-winning Swedish economist Carl Gunnar Myrdal, who said that rent control is the worst example of poor planning by governments lacking courage and vision.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're not taking off the shelf a rent control model used in other parts of the world.
Well, you can't, can you, because you don't have the power.
We're not taking off the shelf a rent control model used in another part of the world. We're deliberately having a bespoke model for London. And any dip in any part of London in increases in rents is just that dip. The levels of rents in London for the last 2 decades have been going up consistently. And anybody who claims it hasn't is just out of touch.
Yes, rents have increased since 2005 by 38% in London. But of course, inflation since then has increased by 37%. So in actual fact, they've been keeping pace with inflation. We're not seeing sharp rises in private rents at all, are we?
But that's exactly the point. So the Assembly member wants to focus on the market rather than the real experience of Londoners and their wages. So it is not the case that Londoners' wages has increased by the rents they've increased over the last period. We know that Londoners can't afford to rent and live
I think,
in
Mr.
London.
Mayor,
we know
young
professionals
well,
in particular can't afford to rent
the government aren't going to
in
grant
London.
you the permission to do this.
Well,
this is a nonsensical policy, Mr. Mayor. It's going to lead to a decrease in rented housing in London. You know that very well. You've cynically introduced this policy, knowing full well you'll never have to implement it, because there's an election in 6 months and you want to appeal to a large number of Londoners. That's what you're doing, isn't it, Mr.
Well, this was the very same point made when many of us lobbied to end the fees paid by tenants to letting agents. Very same points made by that part of the chamber saying, why are you wasting your time? Lo and behold, we persuaded even a Conservative government to outlaw tenants having to pay a fee to letting agents. We said for some time, no-fault evictions are really bad because they mean that tenants have no security of tenure. These guys said this is a cheap stunt to win votes. What happened? The government has announced plans to consult on the removal of Section 21 on no-fault evictions. And these very same people are now saying there's no point campaigning or lobbying for rent controls because this government will not do it. Well, the good news is this Prime Minister won't be around for much longer.
Finished.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order, yes. You have to stand.
I will. Assembly Member Bacon referred to some work that the Housing Committee did on rent control a few years ago, and I know this well because I was chairing the committee at the time. And I think he inadvertently slightly misled us in the sense that he said that all the scenarios that we modelled in that would result in a shrinkage of the PRS. It wouldn't, which it wouldn't, except in one scenario at the upper level. It would only reduce it relative to what would already happen. It would not have reduced the size in absolute terms under any scenario by the upper estimate in one.
Assembly Member Bacon.
I said in some circumstances, but in every single scenario that is in that report, it shows a decrease in the number of affordable homes. Private rented homes.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, no, you're not going to have a conversation. You've challenged. You've made a challenge, and the Assembly Member.
Scenario shows a reduction.
No, not in absolute terms.
Points of view.
This is angels dancing on the head of a pin.
No, it isn't. I think the member has quite rightly challenged something that he heard, and then the Assembly Member has actually used documentation to respond, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. Let's now move on to the question in the name of Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome the review into rape cases conducted by my Victims Commissioner Claire Waxman, London's first. It amplifies the experience of victims of one of the most heinous and harmful crimes. This excellent work is helping to drive change at a national level and is exactly the kind of work envisaged when I created the post of a Victims Commissioner for London. The Stark report highlights the urgent work needed across the CJS to ensure victims achieve swifter justice and are supported throughout the process. It's shocking that 58% of victims feel unable to continue and withdraw from the process, and only 3% of reported rapes result in conviction. It's even less around the country. The review uncovered key learnings, such as showing if victims had easily accessible, appropriate and timely information with trauma-informed support, then chances of withdrawal decrease. This insight is already being taken forward through additional money allocated from our Violence Against Women and Girls Fund to improve and increase capacity at the London Havens, including helping provide video-recorded interviews and early evidence kits. More generally, I'm pleased that all partners have welcomed the report and are committed to working with the Victims Commissioner. Working together, we can ensure that victims aren't forced to choose between their rights to privacy or access to justice, or to feel they have to withdraw in order to access the support for their recovery. My Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime will be convening a Justice Matters as an opportunity for partners to come together to discuss the recommendations and agree an action plan.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mayor. I didn't get all of that, but I'm going to put two questions to you. So there was a report released by the CPS this morning showing that despite an increase in the number of offences, fewer cases are going to court than ever before. So this is clearly a national problem. And the average amount of time for a survivor to reach a trial outcome in London was something in the region of 18 months, clearly unacceptable. The Victim Commissioner was before the Police and Crime Committee last week, and she told us that this is likely to have gotten worse after the disclosure issues arising from the well-known case of R.V. Allen. So how can we reduce the time it takes for a decision to be made in court?
Well, I mean, it's a really important point. And one of the things that I've done is, despite objections from some in this Assembly, increase the amount of money we give to victims and survivors to help pay for independent sexual violence advocates, really important, and to support London Havens. So more support for victims and survivors is important, but also we need to speed up the time between a report being made to the police and it reaching trial. That means the police, the CPS and the courts condensing the length of time it takes for a trial to reach court. In my view, we should have swifter justice than we currently do, because it's hardly surprising that somebody who's made a complaint may not proceed with it if it takes 18 months between making the complaint and it reaching trial. It's very, very stressful, really anxious times, and you can understand why victims and survivors don't want to relive the trauma.
So, I mean, there are specific things that can be done. As you yourself said, over half of the victims decide to withdraw the allegations, and we talked about the length of time. But, for instance, I think the Victim Commissioner talks about this. If the survivor participated in the video-recorded interview, they are 6 times less likely to withdraw from the process. Any other form of actions that you think we can take to reduce the number of allegations?
Well, this is a really important point here, Chair. So I was criticised by some members for the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime giving money to those who are the victims of violence against women and girls, and criticised for investing in these projects. But it's really important that we do so. And you've highlighted the reasons why. The havens that we support from MOPAC helps pay for the support and helps video recorded interviews, forensic medical suites, which is so important. We do need more resources. It is a travesty. There is a waiting list in some of our rape crisis centres and people can't receive the help that they need. And that's one of the reasons why we had the new funding in the last financial year to help them deal with the waiting list.
Mr. Mayor, I'll finish on this one. I've really got to put this to you because we've been talking about these issues for the last 20, 30
Correct.
years. And it's like a sense of deja vu. Yesterday there was a report about the rise in reported homophobic hate crimes. And the picture is the same. The level of prosecutions has actually gone down by half. And I will be writing to you in the CPS in due course. But see, from the victim's perspective, the reasons for withdrawal are stress, trauma, lack of police contact, lack of information, the sheer length of time it takes for investigation. The CPS, and this is the report that came out this morning, they actually seem to be blaming the police. They are saying that they get fewer rape referrals, a 12% fall from the previous year, and cases are taking longer because of digital evidence and demands to disclose material defense. Campaigners from End Violence Against Women actually are now blaming the CPS. They are saying CPS lawyers have quietly changed their approach, no longer building rape prosecutions and screening cases out if they think that the jury will not convict. So it's basically this pattern that you and I actually both have been practitioners, people just passing the blame on, onto other agencies. I mean, this really has got to stop.
And it's heartbreaking because we heard these same points made 20 years ago. The good news is the DPP and the Commissioner have discussed this issue. The Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime and the Victims Commissioner have discussed this issue. And I think the CPS and police understand the importance of working together to get the right conclusion.
Okay, I will be writing to you then.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bailey's question on housing and infrastructure.
Thank you, Chair. New housing should be supported by sufficient infrastructure, and my new London plan puts the issue of infrastructure right at the heart of planning for London's future growth. Analysis undertaken by City Hall using the same methodology used by the previous mayor shows that we need to deliver around 65,000 new homes every year to meet London's housing needs. But this will only be sustainable if the new homes are accompanied by the necessary investment in infrastructure, including transport, utilities, social and green infrastructure. My London plan is unequivocal. New development proposals must be proportionate to the capacity of the existing planned infrastructure. It also places a clear requirement on boroughs to proactively plan for the delivery of future infrastructure to support new housing. The housing crisis in London, which has been decades in the making, means that many Londoners cannot afford to buy a home of their own. Too many people are living in overcrowded housing, and levels of rough sleeping has increased. Contrary to what people say, this isn't hype. Due to our focus on housing since 2016, we've started building a record number of new social and genuinely affordable homes, at the same time as ensuring that new housing developments make a contribution towards infrastructure provision. As Mayor, I've secured nearly £800 million to provide new infrastructure that will enable the delivery of an extra 44,000 new homes. We want to get on with investing this money, but unfortunately, the government has been slowing down our progress. The reality is that when it comes to national infrastructure, we've had a decade of drift, delay and failure under this government. The spending review last week was yet another missed opportunity. Instead of wasting so much money on planning for a no-deal Brexit, the government should have galvanised growth through a long-term commitment to investing in the critical infrastructure we need. I welcome this Assembly member's newfound interest in infrastructure, and I urge him to join me in speaking up for London by calling on the government to meet all the recommendations of the National Infrastructure Commission, as well as committing to funding Crossrail 2 and the Bakerloo Line Southern Extension.
Are you satisfied that in all your developments to build on TfL car parks, you're providing enough parking for residents and commuters?
So in which particular development?
All of them.
What a silly question. It depends which development we're talking about. So in some parts of London, where there's a car park next to a station with very good links in the centre of London, clearly the need for a car park is less than it was years ago. In other parts of London, in Outer London, for example, where the transport links may be less good and people are commuting, there may be a greater need. So I'm not really sure how to answer that question, Chair.
Let me give you an example. For example,
here we go.
In Finchley Central, you're removing all of the car parking, building a development or proposed to build a development of 668 flats, and you're only providing 11 parking spaces. Are you happy with that?
Well, I need to look at the particular development at its time. I don't know the details of that particular site, but what the planning team does is they look at what the public transport provisions are in the area. It's called a PTEL, and they have various criteria in relation to poorly served public transport links and better public transport links. And the local planning committee, if they're unhappy with the public transport provision versus car parking spaces, can use it as a reason to refuse a site. And I expect the council, whichever one it is, to make a decision based on the merits of the application rather than, prejudices that may be had.
So you would tell what would you say to the residents of places like Northwood, Stanmore, Cannons Park, Arnos Grove, Cockfosters, who are all very distressed about the removal of this amenity? They need this amenity in order to make family life workable, so they can get onto the tube system, they can move around. What would you say to them about what's being proposed on their local car park?
Well, I can't speak about the specific site, but in general terms, it's worth looking at who's using the car park. It's worth looking at seeing if there are other public transport links. I was given an example recently of a station where there's a car park next to the station, and actually when there was some work done, it was in Waltham Forest. The leader found out that the users of the station weren't Waltham Forest residents, and when there were genuinely affordable homes built on that car park, all the residents locally were welcoming of the development, and the people who had complained about the car parks, none of them live locally anyway. They were using it as a way to travel in long distances, park their car, sometimes for free or very low sums of money, then use TfL public transport facilities. And I'm in favour of addressing the issue of poor quality here in London, increasing the numbers who use public transport. We want to get to a position where more people walk, cycle, use public transport. Currently 64%, we want to get to 80% by 2041.
So can residents rely on you to support them when they go back to their councils and complain about the loss of this amenity? Are you saying that you will support them in that and they won't just get bulldozed and rolled over?
Well, I don't at the moment sit as a councillor on that planning committee. and so I can't decide what happens on that planning application. And so what will happen is the councillors on that plan application will decide whether to give permission or not. If a scheme is above a certain size, it comes to me, and so if it comes to me, I'll consider it on its merits. But because I have a quasi-judicial function, it'd be inappropriate. Anybody who is even thinking about running for mayor should know this. It'd be inappropriate for me to prejudice my view by giving a view on an application that may come before me. It's an astonishing question.
It's not inappropriate for me to ask you to support residents across London. Thank you very much, Chair.
Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of housing and infrastructure, Mr Mayor, I would have thought our priority should be public transport infrastructure and things like Crossrail 2 and devolution of metro services to London rather than car parking. But I wanted to ask you a quick question on the compulsory purchase of land, because that's often the barrier to delivering both new housing and new infrastructure. Both Labour and the Conservative parties in 2017 pledged to reform compulsory purchase laws to make it easier for local councils to buy up land for housing, for infrastructure. I wondered if you made any progress, or if you knew if the government were making any progress on actually implementing those reforms.
Look, can I just say, you can understand, Chair White, that I don't let him speak, and when he has spoken, he leaves the chamber. It's quite astonishing, but there you go. In relation to land assembly reform, we've been lobbying the government in relation to this area. It's really important to get land assembly reform, because it's difficult to buy pockets of land next to a bigger piece of land that could really make much more opportunity for regeneration. We'll continue to lobby the government to make progress here. The good news is it's cross-party, maybe not in the chamber, maybe not in the assembly, but it's cross-party across London with the council leaders, but also across the country, and we'll carry on trying to lobby the government.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Okay. Now move to the question in the name of Assembly Member McCartney. Police numbers.
Thank you, Chair. It's noteworthy. We're talking about police numbers, and the Assembly Bailey's left the chamber. Really important issue. I'm really pleased the rest of you. I'm really pleased, Chair. The rest of you have stayed for this important issue.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor, can I just say, every time you mention Assembly Members Bailey, you do give him the right to come back, and we don't really need
that's what I'm hoping for, Chair. We want him to take part in this debate. It's the Assembly.
No, it's not for you to goad him.
Well, he's not here to respond. He's run away.
No, please. Can you just answer Assembly Member McCartney's question?
Well, can I thank you for this question, the sort of question I expect from somebody who's serious about representing Londoners and being a member of this Assembly as a full-time job. I welcome the fact that the government has finally woken up to the reality that cuts to policing have contributed to the rise in violence and crime nationally. You can understand why Assembly Bailey has fled the chamber. It's a shame that Conservative members of this Assembly and the previous Conservative government have stubbornly refused to accept this link. Government cuts have led to the Met having the lowest numbers of officers for 16 years. So the announcement of the intention to recruit 20,000 police officers across the country is welcome. However, it remains to be seen if there will be sufficient funding to pay for these officers and how many will be allocated to the Met. We urgently need clarity from the government on funding and numbers so we can get on and recruit, not least because of the long timelines to recruit officers. In London, the Commissioner and I are seeking an increase of 6,000 officers above the additional 1,300 officers I've provided funding for. This would represent a fair allocation to London, in line with the Met representing around a quarter of national policing. It also recognised the particular challenges around violence and the historic underfunding of the National and International Capital Cities grant. That increase would see London's officer numbers increase to 37,000, putting us on par with New York, which is also a global city, albeit smaller. It's worth noting that the New York Department have 15,000 staff on top of this, significantly more than the Met's 10,000. Anything less is a failure of the government to get a grip on violence and crime, and contrary to the new and current Prime Minister's commitment. The government must also ensure they fully fund this commitment, not just the salaries of the new officers, but the additional funding needed for the equipment, accommodation and support staff. I'm also concerned by reports that some of the proposed 20,000 officers might be allocated to the NCA and counter-terrorism. While it's clearly essential that these agencies receive additional resources, it shouldn't come at the cost of additional frontline officers that the Prime Minister promised. It's been clear that the government needs to properly fund preventative services to tackle crime. The approach must be toughen crime and toughen the causes of crime. I'm doing all I can in London, including through investing in the police and a £45 million Young Londoners Fund, but the government cannot shirk their responsibility. This is a national problem that requires national solutions.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And we in this chamber have been very clear that we want the government to act and increase funding to police officers. Would it surprise you if an Assembly member had previously stated that increasing police numbers is absolutely useless in deterring crime?
I simply don't believe that any member of this Assembly would believe that or say that.
And would it surprise you if that same Assembly member had previously stated that the police should not deal with low-level crimes such as abusive behaviour or antisocial behaviour?
Again, I don't believe that a member of this Assembly would say that. Anybody who's experienced alarm, harassment or distress, anybody who's met constituents who've experienced harassment, alarm, distress, which basically violates the basic rights of other human beings, understands how distressing and harmful it is. The idea that the police are either absolutely useless in deterring crimes or that the police shouldn't deal with antisocial behaviour, I find inexplicable.
So do I, Mr Mayor. But you've recently had a meeting with the new Home Secretary and talked about police funding. Can I ask that we know that police officer numbers have been slashed due to these governments funding the austerity that's happened. But also, you mentioned it in your answer to me, that police staff, including PCSOs, that support vital backup to our frontline officers, have also been slashed under your predecessor, Mayor Johnson, now Prime Minister. Was there any indication that funding would be given in addition to the funding for these extra police officers for the support that they need to do their jobs out in the street?
No, there wasn't. First, we should give credit where it's due. We should give credit to this Prime Minister and this Home Secretary for performing a U-turn. I've been saying since May 2016, cuts have consequences, they've gone too far. The Conservatives in this Assembly, the Conservatives in Parliament and in government have been saying no, the cuts haven't had consequences. The reason for the increase in violent crime is not because of cuts. To be fair to the Prime Minister, this Home Secretary, they accept cuts have gone too far, they don't invest in policing. The bad news is there's no real detail about the numbers of police who will get all the additional support you refer to, support staff, CSOs, the estate, lockers, IT equipment, the kit they need. And we need reassurance from the government that any new investment will be for frontline police officers, but also for the other support they need.
At a recent Police and Crime Committee, the Deputy Commissioner of the Met stated that they wanted to ask, and I'm quoting here, ask for additional assistance. Some of that will be additional monetary assistance. Some of it will be to look at the support services that we rely on so heavily and our partners, such as mental health, youth outreach workers, social services and diversion schemes. And he went on to say that as a result in a reduction in police budgets, we've seen a drawing down, a drawing back in all of these services, and that has, we believe, impacted on the situation we are seeing today. Was there any talk about putting money into those services?
No, so far, we've had no commitment from the government to give us support towards preventative services. I raised this in the meeting with the Home Secretary. She seemed receptive, and she did seem to understand the prevention side of the cohesion. And this is one of the legacies of receiving poor advice from your youth advisor when you were number 10 in 2010.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No, thank you. Then let's go on to next question in the name of Assembly Member Hall. Speak God.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your question. Any assault on officers in the line of duty is totally unacceptable. I'd like to take this opportunity, as I'm sure you would, and the Assembly, to pay tribute to Met Police Constable Stuart Alton, who was injured in the line of duty in London on the 8th of August. I hope that some members will join me in wishing him a full recovery. I also, Chair, through you, want to pay tribute to PC Andrew Harper, who was killed in August. Whilst PC Harper was not a London Met Police officer, I know we're all shocked and saddened by his death. The Met Commission is clear that if somebody attacks a police officer, this must not be considered a minor issue, and I fully agree with her. I'm absolutely committed to keeping officers safe. They must have the right protection as they go about their duties. We know that one of the awful ways they are attacked is by being spat at or bitten. That's why I supported the Commissioner's operational decision for a staged rollout of spit and bite guards beyond their previous use just in custody, which began during my time as Mayor. While supporting this measure, obviously they must always be in a proportionate and transparent way. That's why spit and bite guards can only be issued to officers trained in their use. As of July 2019, all officers attending their individual safety training have received training in the use of spit and bite guards, and that is 6,037 police officers and 208 dedicated detention officers. The full rollout of training should be completed by April 2020. As with any police use of force, spit and bite guard deployment, they're recorded to provide transparency and accountability, and these are made publicly available on a monthly basis on the Met Police Service website. While we're discussing officer safety, with permission, I want to mention tasers.
No, not in my time at
Fine.
the moment. I'm running out of time.
If
I will happily
that's
have
not a concern,
discussion about that another time.
Sure. If that's not a concern, we won't discuss that.
Mr Mayor, while your eyes are firmly on Brexit, mine are firmly on the safety of Londoners, and particularly our incredible police officers. Now, it was eventually agreed by Cressida Dick that frontline officers could have spit guards on the 7th of February 2019. If you're telling me that they're not getting them until April 2020, that is an absolute disgrace. Perhaps you would concentrate more on what's going on in London. The fact that the BTP officers have got them, the City of London police officers have got them, and the Metropolitan police officers haven't, is an absolute scandal. Teaching people to put spit hoods on does not take a couple of years. I would urge you to make sure that this rollout goes out very, very quickly. It's totally inappropriate that other police officers that work on our street have access to spit guards, but our Metropolitan police officers do not.
Yeah, yeah.
Chair, is that a question? I don't know what that was.
No, I think it was commentary, wasn't it? What was the question?
Don't you agree that they should have them before 2020?
Okay, so let me deal with it if it's a question. So I'm surprised that any member doesn't realise the size of our police service in London. Notwithstanding the massive cuts, we're 30,000 police officers. That's about a quarter of the national police officers in the country. To compare the size of the Met Police Service with the size of small forces across the country just beggars belief. What we have in London is a situation where every officer who uses a bite guard needs to be trained to use them. Now, if some of them are suggesting that we have all staff taken off frontline policing to be trained to use them at the same time, that's a recommendation I can't accede to. What I will do, Chair, is listen to the advice of the Commissioner and those who've got expertise in policing, which is to train officers as soon as possible in the use of bite guards. Met police officers have been trained more rapidly than any police service around the country, and we have a situation where huge progress has been made. And the police think, and by the way, this is on top of the other training police officers receive, that training should be completed by April 2020. Now, I'm surprised.
Chairman.
At the same time, we are commending our Commissioner for being appointed a Dame Commander of the British Empire. She's been criticised by an Assembly member who has no experience or expertise in policing. And to play party politics with Dame Commander British Empire, Cressida Dick, is astonishing. And I hope she'd reflect on this and withdraw her comments.
Thank you.
The next question is in the name of Assembly Member Copley, homelessness.
Can I thank you for your question? The rise in homelessness in recent years is a national disgrace. I know some members of the Assembly think that this is hype. It's not hype. It's a national disgrace. And that's why my plan of action sets out what investment we need from the government to help everyone off the streets for good, and what ministers must do to stop people being forced into homelessness in the first place. Over the last 3 years, we've been doing everything we can at City Hall to offer new and expanded services to help rough sleepers in London all year round. For example, when I first came into office, emergency winter shelters only opened when 3 consecutive days of freezing temperatures were forecast. That was unacceptable, and I changed this to make them open on any day that temperatures fell below zero, anywhere in London. This year, we'll be going much further. We will be opening our shelters continuously from the end of Christmas period until at least the end of February. and I want councils and charities to do the same. So I've launched my £2.2 million Life Off the Streets winter programme to support them in doing so. As a result of extra funding I've agreed and money we've secured from the government, City Hall's rough sleeping budget this year will be more than double the £8.5 million it was when I came to office. Our services helped more people last year than ever before, but the government is failing to play its part. Whilst my plan of action sets out how £574 million is needed, since it was published last year, the government's given us just £39 million to London. What's more, the government continues to ignore its policies like cuts to the welfare system and public services for the most vulnerable that are forcing more people onto the streets in the first place. Until the government steps up and addresses these root causes, we will never be able to end homelessness.
Thank you very much for that response, Mr. Mayor. And I was pleased to see from your response to one of my written questions that you don't, or the GLA does not pass on rough sleepers' details to the Home Office. And I'm also pleased that Haringey and Islington councils have done similar. What can you do to make sure that no London boroughs see deportations as the answer to our homelessness crisis?
Thank you for your comments and your question. I just don't think enforcement is the way to solve rough sleeping. I obviously haven't got the powers to tell councils what to do. What we are doing is working with London councils who represent the 33 boroughs so they understand our experience in relation to if one is trying to help a rough sleeper but you seem to be an enforcer, how that can prevent that rough sleeper seeking assistance. So I'm going to carry on trying to work with London councils so there is the same sort of good practice we see from Haringey and Islington spread to other councils as well.
Thank you very much. And of course, another thing that might be seen by people who are sleeping rough as a threat of deportation may come as a result of a no-deal Brexit and the possible end of freedom of movement. Do you think there's a risk that some of the most vulnerable Londoners on our streets will get caught up in this and either be denied access to vital services or be scared of accessing those services for the fear of deportation?
Yeah, that's the concern. That's one of the reasons why we've stepped up efforts to do outreach work, and we have on the 21st September an open day here in City Hall. I'm really concerned about people who are vulnerable rough sleepers being scared about their future status in the country because of fears of a no-deal Brexit, the end of free movement, the end of their rights as EU citizens. The government has said that EU citizens' rights will be the same after a no-deal Brexit. I'm not sure that's the case legally, by the way. That's the advice that's the views of some EU citizens said back to us, and it's really important we clarify the position. But if you're a rough sleeper and you're vulnerable, you're probably not conducive to receiving good legal advice or are receiving good legal advice, and I'm really concerned about the consequences on rough sleeping, but also people being hidden away because they're worried about being, caught and deported.
Absolutely. And we know now that well, for some time now, the leading cause, not just of rough sleeping, but of homelessness in general, has been the end of a private tenancy. It's one of the reasons why I would agree with an approach that involves rent controls, because it's about stability for people, not just about affordability. But one of the biggest drivers has, of course, been people not being able to pay the rent because of austerity and because of welfare cuts. We had the Chancellor's statement the other day. Did you hear anything in that that made you think that perhaps the government were going to be changing their policy on welfare, which of course has seen people's incomes reduced significantly over the last few years?
So we had literally this time last year the former Prime Minister saying it was the end of austerity. And I've seen no evidence in relation to the government's policies around welfare reform, around universal credit rollout, in relation to some of the consequences of their policy leading to rough sleeping, of any change in tax. And what we need from the government is to understand that rough sleeping is the symptom of some of the policies they have. It's a pipeline. No-fault evictions is one example why people become homeless. It could be a lack of benefits to top up private rents. It could be mental health issues. It could be breakup of family life. It could be loss of job. And the pipeline needs to be addressed. And the figure you quoted in your first question was the cost of stopping a pipeline of people becoming rough sleepers in the first place. We will do our bit helping those who are vulnerable, but wouldn't it be far better to stop them being rough sleepers in the first place?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome a group of service users from Harrow Mencap who have just joined us in the gallery. Welcome. And the next question is in the name of Assembly Member Eshalomi, Car Free Day.
Thank you. Toxic air pollution in our city is a public health crisis. We know that more than 50% of London's harmful air is caused by vehicles. As part of my ongoing commitment to make London a greener and healthier city for Londoners, I'm working with a number of London boroughs to deliver London's biggest ever car-free day celebration on Sunday, the 22nd of September. Car-free day will allow hundreds of thousands of Londoners of all ages to leave the car at home, explore our city by foot or on bike, and get involved in hundreds of free activities. As well as my Central London Car-Free Day event, at least 13 boroughs will be hosting their own community events on Car-Free Day, and a number of boroughs will be supporting local play streets, where streets will be closed for local residents. In total, there will be over 200 play streets running across London on that day. Top boroughs to host these events, I provided funding through my Air Quality Fund to boroughs and residents to help them develop local programmes. This includes funding 250 car-free schemes ranging from play streets and one-off events like e-bike trials, bike repairs and pocket parks through to more permanent pedestrianisation schemes. To ensure Londoners hear about these incredible events, TfL has been promoting them through their advertising channels and through partner and community organisations including Ride London, Open House, the City of London and Live in Streets, as well as their own TfL Schools travel programme. We've also provided boroughs with a pack of free promotional materials they can customise. 10 boroughs are already using the materials to promote their events and tell residents about fun activities from street picnics to music and entertainment. And my team is working closely with London boroughs to coordinate all our many car-free day activities.
Great, no, thank you for that, Mr. Mayor. I think it is really important. I know that you're working with a number of boroughs, and I'm quite proud that my two boroughs, Lambeth and Southwark, are two of the boroughs working with you in TfL. You said that in July, 19 boroughs had already signed up to take part. Do you know what the final tally of all the participating boroughs are in London? Has there been more of a take-up, especially some of the outer London boroughs?
Well, Chair, in July, I said that 19 boroughs were taking part in this scheme, and I'm really happy to correct the record today, saying it's not 19 taking part, there are now 27 taking part, which is fantastic news.
That's fantastic. And you've already said that, you know, this is a really big issue, and obviously you'll recall that in 2016, the Environment Committee at Parliament and the Audit Committee said that this is a national health emergency. The fact is, 10,000 people in London are dying a year from this, and we need to get more people out to their cars. Cars are the most polluting things in terms of air quality. Do you think then that it's quite worrying that the Tories have branded this car-free day a PR stunt when Londoners are dying from poor air quality?
Well, I'd be astonished if Conservatives call this a PR stunt, but then these were the same Conservatives that opposed bringing in the ultra-low emission zone this year, the same Conservatives who think car parks are infrastructure rather than encouraging people to walk, cycle and use public transport. And that's why it's really important for Londoners to know, if you want an administration that's on the side of cleaning up the air, that's on the side of walking, cycling and public transport, don't vote Tory.
Yeah, and I think, again, you know, the play streets and car-free days is really important. I live in a flat with two young children, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and going from our flat to the park, the biggest barrier sometimes is crossing the roads and the number of cars. Is there more that you and TfL could be doing to try and promote more regular car-free days, and looking at maybe opportunities where there may be redundant roads, redundant spaces, to actually get more pedestrianised areas, so actually we can get more people out of their cars, out enjoying the roads and the clean air?
And this is the crux of what the car-free day is about. It's us reimagining our city. If you've been raised in a city where you assume everyone's going to drive and park next to a tube station, or if you assume our roads have to be dangerous, you can't imagine the alternative. And so I don't apologise for trying to address the fact that every year in London, 4,000 people either lose their lives or are seriously injured on our roads. I apologise for taking action to fix some of the junctions around our city. We need Londoners on our side. We need Londoners to put pressure on us to go even further. And that's why I don't criticise people challenging me to go even further on some of the issues. And so we want Londoners to enjoy the car-free day on the 22nd of September, and then use that as a springboard to get your imagination thinking about what more we can do. Put pressure on your local councils, let them put pressure on me, we put pressure on the government if need be, to make sure more and more of London is friendly to people walking, cycling and using public transport. But it means us taking on those people who think car parks in the heart of our city are infrastructure. They aren't.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll leave it there.
Next question from Assembly Member O'Connell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your question. Operation Midland was started in November 2014 and was closed in March 2016. The impact of Carl Beech's false allegations and the subsequent Operation Midland investigation has been truly dreadful for those who are accused and their families. It's absolutely right that Carl Beach is being held to account and facing justice for his actions. The then Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, apologised in person to those affected, and the Met has expressed deep regret for what happened. In February 2016, the Met Police Service commissioned retired High Court Judge Sir Richard Henriques to undertake a review of Operation Midland to learn lessons about their handling of the investigation. That was the right thing to do, as clearly a number of serious errors were made. The Met Police Service has already enacted the majority of Sir Richard's recommendations, and MOPAC has been working closely with them to ensure lessons have been learned. It's also right that the Met Police Service is going to publish as full a version of the Henriques report so that there can be no doubt about the analysis of the failings. I've been assured this will be done as quickly as possible. As a result of Sir Richard's report, the Met voluntarily referred itself to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, now the Independent Office of Police Conduct. This referral included the applications for search warrants. The Met Police fully cooperated with the independent investigation, which lasted more than 2 years, and have examined all the evidence, did not identify any criminal offence or misconduct. The IPCC was the appropriate body to conduct this investigation. The Independent Office of Police Conduct have recently completed their investigation and have said it will publish their report this month. The Met Police is committed to ensuring that any further lessons from the report will be taken on board and implemented.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor, for your full response. It was only last week in this chamber that the Police and Crime Committee had an exchange with the Deputy Commissioner on this subject. I raised this with you, particularly with your role as being responsible for holding the Met Police to account. I know that the investigation was launched pre your mayoralty, but you still have that responsibility. The investigation itself cost, and the costs are still rising upwards of towards £4 million, and we've talked about the police budget and what could be done with that sort of money. We also know that reputations of public figures, lifetime of public service, were trashed as a result of that investigation. Mr Mayor, do you believe that the Met Police have learnt the lessons and that will not be repeated that we've seen? Are you satisfied with the investigation?
Well, when you see the impact on some of the innocent people affected and their families, heartbreaking, and I also apologise to them as well. I hope the lessons are learned. The honest answer is I can't say for sure until we have an example where the public can be reassured the right lessons have been learned, and the proof will be in the pudding. I'm reassured we're doing what we can to hold the Met Police to account. I'm reassured that the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner understand the seriousness of the lessons that are to be learned, and we've got to make sure all of us, the Police and Crime Committee, me as the Mayor, as Deputy Police, the Deputy Mayor as well, do what we can to make sure the right lessons are learned.
Okay, Mr Mayor, there was a catastrophic failure of performance. You're here to hold the Met to account performance. This is not about a witch hunt against frontline officers, because there's been enough of a witch hunt around the whole Beach affair. This is about, I believe, controls, checks and supervision above that, and that was commented last week in the Police and Crime Committee. So a breakdown in the controls and checks and supervision of officers dealing with these affairs. The Henriques review that you refer to has not yet been published in an unredacted form, and the author of that report itself said that there's no reason why it should be unredacted. Would you like to comment on that briefly on those 2 points?
Yeah, my understanding is that concerns are actually some of the nature of the allegations made by Carl Beach, and actually they are, without guided by you, that they're quite salacious and quite inappropriate.
Yes, that's correct.
And so my understanding is that the police will share the report with the families and their representatives, and it's in their hands in relation to what is redacted and what isn't. They may well ask for, not because they have anything to hide, but because of some of the nature of the allegations, they're really not very nice.
No, I get that.
And so, subject to that, a complete version as possible will be made public.
Okay. I think this is lastly for me. This, as I say, this has cost the public purse upwards of £4 million. This is, public figures have been ruined, partly with the support of your deputy leader in Parliament. It must be said, without.
Well, no, hold on, Chair. No, Chair, that is really inappropriate, Chair, because let's be quite clear. An allegation was made which was investigated by the police. Yeah. The police made mistakes, which was investigated by the IPCC, the IOPC, and now a retired High Court judge. And for the Slim member to bring in others who brought the complaints to the attention of the police and try and cast suspicion on them, I think it's inappropriate and a reflection.
That's a comment of fact. But let's put that to one side. So my final point is, will you be continuing to take an interest in this investigation? Because the cost is running to the public purse. There is still structures that need to be looked at. Will you continue to take an interest in this investigation?
Yeah, I do, and there is still, of course, ongoing litigation as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And next question is in the name of Assembly Member Hall, Indian High Commission protest.
Thank you, Chair. Londoners of Indian origin and Londoners and London's Indian community make a huge contribution to this great city, from helping to power our economy through businesses, both big and small, to enhancing London's vibrant arts and culture scene, to being a vital part of our NHS workforce. Londoners of Indian origin have demonstrated time and time again that our diversity is one of our city's greatest strengths. At a time when many are trying to divide us, Londoners of Indian origin and London's Indian community help demonstrate to the rest of the world that in London we celebrate and embrace our diversity and differences. Whilst I support the right to protest when it is peaceful and lawful, I condemn in the strongest terms the violence and damage to property from a small minority of protesters that took place on August the 15th and at subsequent protests outside the Indian High Commission. These acts are completely unacceptable, and my team have been in touch with the Indian High Commission, with whom my office has a great working relationship. I want to be clear that anyone who is found to have acted unlawfully will be pursued by the Met Police Service. I've personally raised this issue with the Met Police, and it is my understanding that 4 individuals were arrested for offences including public order and possession of an offensive weapon. Investigations concerning 2 of those individuals are ongoing. As the Assembly know, as Mayor, I do not have the power to ban marches and protests in London. These powers lie with the Home Secretary. They are an important part of our democracy, though, and I support protests as long as it is peaceful. The Assembly will also be aware that the policing response to protests is led as an operational matter by the Met Police, who were and are in touch with the Indian High Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm glad to hear that you say you condemn this, but when I was looking at your Twitter feed, there's nothing about it on there. You congratulated people on their A-level results, which is appropriate, of course. You obviously tweeted about fighting against Brexit, because that's what you seem to do all the time. But given that this was such a serious event, nothing, absolutely nothing. Now, I got an email. I mean, I'm sure you understand why people are feeling disappointed by your initial non-response. One email said, and I'm quoting here, the mayor failed to condemn the attack, has maintained complete silence on this issue, with no acknowledgement of the significant harm caused to the community, the Indian community. And I'm not surprised. Some of the reports I've heard, burning of flags, throwing of eggs, aggression, and yet you feel you do not need to comment on it on the time, when you can also comment about the fact that it's hot. We had five tweets about it being hot, and yet you've got, I'm so sorry if you're bored looking everywhere, but I'm sorry if you think that these points I'm making are inappropriate. But I think it's totally inappropriate that we've got a mayor that will constantly mention Brexit, and yet we have thousands of people on the street burning the Indian flag, throwing eggs, and yet you say nothing. What is your defence of saying absolutely nothing on this issue, Mr. Mayor?
Chair, just as some guidance, how much time do I have to respond to that?
I'm happy to give you the same time that the question took.
Great. So, Chair, I'm really pleased that the Assembly member, like more than 1 million Londoners, follows me on Twitter. I think it's really important to understand that on Twitter you can get across lots of points of view. Twitter's not the only way I communicate with Londoners and those around the globe. I also use Facebook. I also have other forms of communicating, that's press releases. But also I speak to people as well, which is really important, and use the mainstream media as well. Now, in relation to the incident outside the Indian High Commission, it was disgraceful that some people appear to have broken the law. It's really important that people, of course, are allowed to protest peacefully and lawfully, but they must obey the laws. And that's why I enjoy living in a democracy where the police are in charge of operational matters when it comes to policing protests. Now, I personally spoke to and was in touch with the Deputy Commissioner of the Police Service, Sir Steve House, to discuss my concerns about what happened outside the Indian High Commission. I did tweet about this, and I'll share with Senator Susan Hall, who clearly doesn't follow me as assiduously as she should in relation to my tweets, and I'll show her the tweet that I sent in relation to this particular issue. The Deputy Mayor for Business, Raj Agrawal, also tweeted about this matter.
That was the third
and what
incident.
I'm happy to do, Chair, is to take advice from some members about how better I can communicate with Londoners in relation to what we're doing in London. And any assistance in amplifying social media messages are gratefully received. But here's the important point. The important point is in relation to the power to ban protests and marches. And that power doesn't lay with the Mayor of London, it lays with the Home Secretary. So if it is the case...
No, it's about your comments.
No, you'll listen to the answer, Assembly Member Hall.
Well, it's filibustering, but if you say so, Madam Chairman.
Yes, you will. You will.
Chair, the rudeness of some members is outrageous.
No,
well, we're reflecting you, Mr Mayor.
Please
Chair.
continue with your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I just think what's for the goose, Chair.
No, please continue with your answer.
Okay, it's not, yeah, fine. So the point is, Chair, if the Assembly Member is concerned about protests or marches being unlawful, what she should be doing is lobbying the Home Secretary. Now, the Home Secretary's got powers to ban marches and ban protests. And if she wants to lobby the Home Secretary in relation to those particular issues, of course, we'll want to see what the grounds are and see if we will support those applications.
Okay, the Conservative group is now out of time. Let's now move to the next question. Is in the name of Assembly Member Shaw.
Thank you, Chair. About a decade of Conservative government has starved. After almost a decade of Conservative government, the NHS has been starved of resources. Despite warm words from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, our NHS and local government are struggling under immense pressure. NHS trusts have a £6 billion backlog in maintenance alone, and that's why the recent announcement of £1.8 billion for capital development is merely a drop in the ocean. In London, we need more funding so that our NHS estate is fit for purpose, both now and for the future. And we need strategic decisions about estates to be taken by London. A journey we've begun through the London Estates Board with the ambition to have a multi-year capital settlement devolved to London. But the NHS also faces wider issues such as workforce. The government is yet to address this, and Brexit is making a bad situation worse. Investment in health and care is urgently needed beyond the NHS itself. The NHS long-term plan will only be deliverable if the government invests in all parts of the system. Social care funding cuts are pushing services to the edge, and despite repeat promises from the government about the social care green paper, all the Chancellor announced last week were further sticking plasters. I've repeatedly called for the government to fully reverse cuts to the local government public health grant, as well as the cuts that have decimated youth and community services. I'll continue to call on the government to give us the powers and resources we need, and I remain committed to champion the NHS and to arguing for the resources it needs to provide the best health and care services for all Londoners.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your full reply. The fact is that the funding commitment for London is only 17 million, and that actually means London will be receiving less than 2% of the overall funding which was announced. In the absence of leadership and commitment from central government, how are you working with clinical commissioning groups in London to develop a long-term plan for healthcare in London? If government won't do anything, certainly we need to, and that's where we want your response, please.
I think your question has highlighted the announcement from the Chancellor last week related to the NHS was a big con. And so I'm worried about the NHS in London for a variety of reasons. I've not got direct powers over many of these things. What I can do is, as chair of the London Health Board, work with colleagues around London. The good news is, on our board, we have the lead chair of London's clinical care group, commissioning group, Sir Sam Everington. So I'll work with him in relation to this area and work in partnership with other key players around the room to make sure we can respond to what the government is saying about a national NHS long-term plan. I don't want you to be under any illusion. I'm worried about the NHS going forward, not just the physical issue, not just the mental issue, not just helping physical issues, mental health issues, but social care as well. And that's why, working together, we're going to try and champion London's NHS, but also be advocates for more resources and support from central government.
That's very reassuring that you are working in partnership with local CCGs, etc., in doing your best that you can for Londoners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Dismore's question, electricity supply resilience.
The power outage on the 9th of August caused serious problems for Londoners, and it's right that everyone involved does their part to avoid it happening again. My officers work closely with the energy suppliers to improve and maintain the resilience of their networks to help keep London running smoothly. My infrastructure high-level group, chaired by my Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe, convened senior representatives from the city's infrastructure sectors, including energy supplies and the national grid, to plan for the future, embedding resilience into their work as London changes and grows. The London Resilience Partnership, over 170 organisations, including energy supplies and the national grid, work together to prepare for and respond to emergencies in our city. My Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience chairs regular meetings of the London Resilience Forum, setting the strategic direction for the wider partnership. In this case, London Resilience made contact with the network operators and power was restored relatively quickly. However, the resilience of the national network is the responsibility of National Grid and ultimately central government. Ofgem is now investigating the circumstances surrounding the outage, and it could take enforcement action against National Grid if necessary. Meanwhile, in London, we continue to work on energy resilience issues. In December, I created an infrastructure coordination team that supports collaboration across organisations. And with increasing local renewable energy generation and electrification of heat and transport networks, we're running smart energy programmes to pilot how we can store and use energy to reduce pressure on the grid.
Well, thank you for that reply. And it's clear that you do agree that the impact on London was serious, with hundreds of people stranded at King's Cross. At some tube stations, lights went out and staff had to guide passengers with torches. Yeah. At Kentish Town, in my constituency, passengers had to leave the train and walk along the track. London Resilience Partnership's risk register rates the risk of failure of the national electricity transmission as very high. But do you believe increasing numbers of severe weather events due to climate change make future power cuts more likely? Could Brexit impact on electricity supply? And if so, what plans have been made to respond to these risks with ever-growing demand for electricity from homes, businesses and transport?
Yeah, there are concerns many have raised in relation to the impact of Brexit on energy supply. We've been reassured by the government that there's no reason to be concerned or alarmed. The problem is they've not shared some of their analysis and the information that they use for their analysis with us. We've been told there is enough resilience there. Your other question, though, is really important about climate change, the impact of climate change and energy security. And that's a more medium to long-term issue where we need reassurance in relation to energy supplies. One of the reasons why I mentioned the pilots we're doing in relation to local work taking place is that helps take some of the pressure off the national grid. All of us will be looking with interest at what Ofgem says in relation to their investigation into National Grid and how they dealt with the outage you referred to.
Well, thank you for that. And on the Brexit issue, it's actually referred to an Operation Yellowhammer, the document that was published yesterday. And it's right, it says that there won't be immediate disruption to electricity or gas interconnectors, but they say it could occur rapidly within months or years after EU exit. It says that in that event there would not be security of supply issues. And in any event, it says there will be likely significant electricity price increases for consumers, business and domestic, with associated wider economic and political impacts. So it is the case that Brexit is likely to impact on electricity supply in the medium to longer term. And in any event, prices are going to go up, affecting Londoners, especially the less well off.
Absolutely. So in my introduction, in my opening statement, I referred to the long-term impacts of Brexit on our city in terms of our economy, jobs and growth. The Yellowhammer document, by the way, we've not seen the redacted paragraph in relation to petrol tariffs, but the government's own assessment is a reason to be concerned, and that's why it's important the government is straight with us in relation to what the future holds with a Brexit, but even worse with a catastrophic no-deal Brexit.
Okay, thank you for that. Will the Assembly Member agree to suspend Standing Order 2.9b in order that we finish the remaining business on the agenda? Agreed. Thank you very much. And the next question is in the name of Assembly Member Dr. Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. Redevelopment of brownfield sites is essential to deliver the homes and infrastructure Londoners need while preserving the Greenbelt and Metropolitan Urban Land. This must always be done safely without risking public health. Responsibility for this lies primarily at the local level. Local authorities are required to maintain a register of potentially contaminated sites in their area and remediate the worst sites. National planning policy is clear that planning proposals should only be supported if the local authority is satisfied that any contamination will be effectively treated, contained and controlled and will not pose an unacceptable risk. Local authorities then use planning conditions to ensure developers deal with any contamination issues during redevelopment. This means they can take enforcement action against developers who are not acting properly. Some on-site activities also need a permit from the Environment Agency who can also take enforcement action if there is a failure to comply. Once planning permission has been granted, it is ultimately the developer's responsibility to comply with planning conditions and environmental regulations, but the local authority and environment agency are responsible for monitoring compliance and taking enforcement action where the rules are broken. Under the GLA Act, I have no responsibilities or enforcement powers over development on contaminated land or land remediation. My draft London plan does, however, encourage strategic approaches to addressing land contamination as part of mitigating negative environmental impacts from development and ensuring good growth for Londoners.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that answer. Of course, I know there's a big push for building more houses, and of course, all those sites which are contaminated are remediated through the planning process. But there's a report saying that from 2000 to 2013, 83% of all the sites that came into use came through the planning process. But the House of Commons report committee in 2016 said, when taking evidence from the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, saying that there's ambiguity in the national planning framework about whose responsibility is to set the environmental standards in planning. And Mr. Price was giving evidence expressed concern that the planning guidance on these matters has reduced dramatically in the national planning framework. And the question I'm really asking is who's responsible, right? Because I have been involved in a personal case, right, in constituency, and this is of interest to London, of where does the buck stop, right? Because the Environment Agency says they don't have any responsibility to monitor air quality, and I know you've been championing air quality also. They say there's, and if you ask public health, they have no responsibility for it either, because they only act on instruction of the local authority if they're asked to do so. And local authorities don't have the funds and the money to monitor those things, and it's left all to the developers. Where is the neutral player in the whole system, looking after the interest of the residents?
Well, ultimately the local council. So you've got this local council, Public Health England and the Environment Agency, but it's a local council that gives permission, lays down conditions of planning, and then must be in charge of enforcement. If there's breaches of the conditions, that's an enforcement action that the local council can take. I think the frustration may be the evidence that the council receiving from the so-called experts is inconsistent with what the residents experience when it comes to smelling stuff. And so ultimately the responsibility lays with the local councils, who are supposed to provide a level of oversight and scrutiny to any application given permission.
I mean, the problem is because we're relying on the developer to do a lot of the monitoring, Mr. Mayor. So supposing the local authorities letting down the residents, the Environment Agency letting down the residents, and Public Health letting down the residents, where can those residents go?
Well, in a real case, rather than a hypothetical one, the council needs to provide the recourse because they gave permission. The council may commission Public Health England or others to do a review of the monitoring data if they don't trust what the developers are saying. So although the data comes from the developer, there's nothing stopping the council having that checked from Public Health England or doing their own monitoring. But the council gave permission. On any application, if you give permission and the developer is breaching those conditions, there's enforcement action options available.
There is a case in Mali, it's his House of Gasworks sites, which was opposed by the local authority at that time. It was brought in by the mayor at that time, in 2010, Mayor Johnson. He gave that permission for that development on the gasworks sites. And yet, right, the monitoring was left to the developer because the local authorities felt that they could trust all. And now the residents, right, are suffering because of air quality, are suffering from pollution from that environment, possibly carcinogenics coming out of the site. And there has been no independent monitoring by the Environment Agency. There's been no independent monitoring by the local authority. And people are concerned. And I'm concerned that we may allow a lot more sites coming to development across London without a proper regulatory process being put in place. And that's why I raise this matter, right, that as we are pushing for more houses to be built and not being built on green belt, there will be more brownfield sites, particularly contaminated sites, which will come into play, and that we must be taking responsibility for making sure there's proper regulatory process.
A very good point. The legacy is not just the potential poor health to your constituents, but the precedent it sets for future confidence or lack of confidence in contaminated sites, which we need to bring forward. And that's one of the reasons why Jules Pipe is encouraging a strategic approach to addressing land contamination But you're right. We can't, on the one hand, say we need to build on this industrial land that's contaminated and there be no confidence about it. And you're right to address this issue, and that's one of the reasons why Jules doing what we can. By the way, we've not got formal powers to do so. We're doing it because of the issues you've raised.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Assembly Member Arnold.
Thank you.
Her question on artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. There are a few areas of technology that will impact on our future economy and society more than artificial intelligence. Last year, I commissioned a report, London, the AI Growth Capital of Europe, and this confirmed that London is the AI capital of Europe. It identified over 750 businesses supplying AI technologies and products in London, more than Paris and Berlin combined. Our universities produce some of the world's leading AI experts, and we have some real homegrown success stories to celebrate. It's my aim to ensure that London is leading in both developing and capitalising on these new technologies. That's why I launched my Technology for Business programme, helping small businesses to take advantage of the new productivity boosting technologies that big companies are already using. In addition, in line with my economic development strategy and Skills for London strategy, I'm running a number of programmes to empower all Londoners to access the education and skills they need for the jobs of tomorrow. These include my £7 million digital talent programme helping young Londoners into digital careers, my £6.4 million adult education budget innovation fund aimed at increasing the digital capabilities of Londoners and tackling digital exclusion, and taking control of London's adult education budget, prioritising improving digital skills among Londoners, careers advice focused on digital and STEM, and support for digital apprenticeships. But more needs to be done, particularly around data, the crucial component of AI from a national level. In June, the government issued a call for evidence for its proposed national data strategy. This important work that should have been taking place before, but has been delayed by the government's focus on Brexit.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Mayor. And as you say, London has a stronger global position in AI in its leading industries, especially finance, insurance and law. The evidence that I gained through the investigation prior to this question is that the rate of AI supplier formation in London is 42% per annum, significantly faster than the global rate of 24% per annum. The other thing I found out was London is an attractor city for this, and so many of the startups have now got EU residents as part of their business grouping. Is your chief officer doing some work to see how this will impact on this, if you like, selling point for the city?
So, Chair, thank you. So I appointed London's first ever Chief Digital Officer.
Yes.
Theo Blackwell's doing a great job in this area, and we're doing lots of exciting work around the data store and making London an attractive place for innovators, startups to come and then to incubate and fly. And I'm really proud that we have more AI companies in London than Paris and Berlin combined. We can't be complacent though, because it's very mobile. You mentioned these talented people. They can move. The actually facilities they need are very minimal. And that's why we've got to keep what we have and attract more. And some of the work Theo's doing is to address some of the challenges, the slow pace of regulation, the slow rules of the game, address some of the challenges around human rights that people have legitimately, but to make sure we continue to be an attractive place for AI. And these jobs are future-proof, and we mustn't be scared of it. We've got to, in my view, make sure that we're ready for this.
Yeah, as with everything in life, there's a downside. And making reference to Assembly Member Berry's question this morning about the dangers, if you like, with our growing dependence on AI and how it really is just part and parcel of our lives. So do you have any plans to work with the Information Commissioner's Office to ensure that the public are informed about when and how their data is collected? Because people think AI, think it's separate, but AI is central to our Oyster card. So we're all carrying around a piece of AI technology. Now, that could be used to track us inappropriately. And of course, going back, we heard about what I would think sounds like inappropriate use by a number of bodies of facial recognition scanning. Are you working with the Information Commissioner's Office
Yes.
to protect us?
Yeah, so one of the roles of the Chief Digital Officer is to make sure we speak to all the regulators. I'm afraid it's not just the one commissioner. There's the Information Commissioner, there's the Surveillance Commissioner, there's the Biometrics Commissioner. We've got to make sure that we keep abreast with concerns, but also you can't disaggregate data from privacy. They're linked. And that's why it's really important that we lobby the government to bring in legislation, regulation as soon as possible. By the way, the innovators and those that do this are crying out for it. They're saying, give us some rules of the game. There are no rules of the game. So, yes, it's exciting. We're using AI to improve quality of services, from chat boxes to air quality monitoring to, you mentioned, contactless payments, to some of the work we're doing in City Hall. This is pioneering stuff. But actually, we need some rules of the game from the government, and then the Commissioner will enforce the rules through regulation. But Theo and the team are spending a lot of time making sure we don't inadvertently breach people's right to privacy. And that's why the London Data Store is doing lots of checks and balances. We're working closely with local authorities, other public service providers, how we use the data, because people don't mind so much anonymised data. People mind less giving data if there's consent. But when there's no consent and it's not anonymised, you can understand legitimately why people are concerned about their civil liberties and human rights. And that's why it's really important, rather than ducking this challenge, we try and address them head on. I think GDPR changes have educated the public to some extent, but I think you can't have a well enough educated public. The more educated the public are, the better it is.
Yes, thank you. Well, your Chief Digital Officer is joining Assembly members for a briefing, and we'll also be joined by a senior officer from the Alan Turing Institute,
Great.
who, of course, was the father of AI.
That's right.
So
That's
we're looking
right.
forward to that, and thanks for the work that's going on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final question from Assembly Member Whittle.
Thank you, Chair. I'm glad that the government has woken up to the devastating impact their cuts to policing are having, which includes cutting the Met Police budget by £1 billion since 2010. Already, we've had to lose £850 million of those £1 billion worth of cuts. 20,000 additional police officers nationally would, of course, be welcome. However, it remains to be seen if there will be sufficient funding to pay for these officers, how many will be allocated to the Met, and how many officers will be frontline officers. We urgently need clarity from the government on funding and numbers so we can get on and recruit, not least because of the long recruitment timelines. The Met is already growing at a pace to meet my commitment to provide 1,300 officers funded from City Hall that would otherwise have been the case. We're aiming to have 31,000 officers by the end of 2019. I'm confident that if the government get on and provide sufficient certainty around funding, we can drive forward recruitment and provide London with the officers we desperately need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I mean, given the urgency of this, I wondered whether you agreed with the policy that the College of Policing announced in 2016, which will come into practice as of next year, i.e. when this is going on, that all new officers should have degrees.
It's not degrees, it's all equivalent. So what it is, they can come without a degree. So, what the College of Policing are saying is there should be a route in, so people during their training can do degree equivalent training in the police service. And what the Met Police are doing is getting ready for that, to make sure that we don't deter people applying to be a police officer who may be deterred by the degree equivalent training.
Well, they do specifically say degrees, Mr. Mayor, and they also have been talking to about 12 universities. So this will be a university degree. The point, I think, the crucial point, is that given the reason for this increase, which is obviously people are not safe on the streets, Lincolnshire Police have calculated, in fact, it would be like taking about 10% of their officers off the street one day a week. And I wonder whether that would concern you from the point of view of the Met, you see.
Well, there's good news, which is the Met Police Service isn't Lincolnshire Police.
Sorry, sir?
We aren't Lincolnshire Police. We are a very different police force. And this applies to new recruits joining, as you're aware. So I've seen no evidence so far that there is a slowness of applying because of this requirement from the College of Policing. What I have seen is the Met Police Service working closely with the College of Policing to make sure that it's not a reason not to recruit. The good news is we've turned the taps on completely in relation to getting new recruits in. If there are concerns that the Met Police Service have in relation to this having an impact on recruitment, they'll raise them with the College of Policing and the Home Sec. But the good news is that we are making good progress in relation to, we're now recruiting more than we have for some time, and we've reduced from 9 months to 8 months. But if there are concerns, I can assure you the Commissioner will raise them with.
It's more than concerns, actually, Mr. Mayor, because Lincolnshire Police have launched or are launching a judicial review of that decision. I mean, just to finish by saying, you know, the BBC reported a retired policeman, Norman Brennan, 31 years in service. He said, the only degree a policeman needs is a degree of common sense, and he will learn on the job. Would you not say that that is actually the correct way and probably the most effective way now, given the situation we're in?
Yeah, I've got some sympathy with that. I mean, I think you can be. It's also the distinction made between the classic distinction between nurses and doctors. The old saying, you know, nurses care, doctors treat, and police officers, their sort of life skills are really important. Their rapport with individuals are really important. The way I describe it is, who could be against anybody having continuing professional development? Who can be against anybody continuing to train and adapt? I was criticised by some for wanting officers to be trained in use of protective equipment. I think it's important for them to be trained. I think you're right. Question, does it need to be a degree?
And also it's a matter of emphasis, surely, given the situation that we are now facing. It's just that this will possibly prolong and inhibit, you know, the fight against crime on the front line.
Well, it's no evidence so far in relation to this. Our biggest inhibitor is government cuts.
I'll leave it there, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Assemblymember McCartney.
Mr. Mayor, earlier you said you welcomed the Prime Minister's U-turn on cuts to police numbers and police funding, but isn't it the case that in fact the cuts to the Met have been greater than they needed, because when he was sitting in that chair he refused to raise the police precept to pay for additional officers?
So in 2010, on the advice of the Youth Advisor, the government cut the Met Police budget by £1 billion. In 2010, the Mayor at the time knew there's £1 billion worth of cuts coming. Between 2010 and 2016, you'd have thought a prudent Mayor would raise council tax precept to try and fill the massive hole left by central government, and or use business rates to leave the massive hole left by central government cuts. But between 2010 and 2016, the previous Mayor, in my view, negligently failed to support London by increasing investment in our policing. And here's the irony. When I became Mayor in my first year, then Home Secretary Amber Rudd criticised me and didn't give me the resources we needed, and blamed the lack of the increase in council tax in the year before I became Mayor. And so in my first 3 years, I've invested more in policing in London than the previous year did in 8 years, and certainly 6 years since I knew the cuts were coming. I welcome his U-turn. I would just hope some of the Tory members of this Assembly would also do a U-turn and apologise for opposing my lobbying for extra resources over the last 3 years, and apologise for not accepting cuts of consequences. And one of the reasons for the increase in violent crime in London is cuts made by a Tory government, supported by the Tory Assembly.
Thank you. And we welcome the announcement about extra money for extra police officers. But I recently saw an interview that Kit Malthouse, the policing minister, gave, and he was Deputy Mayor for Policing in this place, and he conceded that no work had actually been done on the practicalities of delivering that promise. And he pointed out the loss of police estate over the last 9 years, and made a particular point about lockers and the need for places to put lockers for police equipment. Do you get the sense that this announcement was made without, as the police minister admits, that practicalities have been delivering it, being done? And are you convinced that the Met is putting sufficient resources into remedying that?
Well, Chair, if the suggestion is that Boris Johnson makes announcements without planning, without preparation, and thinks on the hoof, I'd say guilty as charged.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for your answers, and we look forward to seeing you in October.
Me too.
Is that prorogation?
Oh yeah, is there?
No, you're here with us in October.
Okay, great.
Absolutely. Can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion that's set out on the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to questions asked. Item 5, the next meeting of London Assembly will be Mayor's Question Time, which will take place at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 17th October 29 in the Chamber City Hall. Just a couple of comments from me. I talked about the Amiga month when I started. The Amiga month is the Ibero-American and Luso-Hispanic 5-week worldwide festival. Now, I know members will want to join me in sending best wishes to the million plus Londoners from that community, and I was interested to find out that their involvement in the growth and prosperity of this city goes back centuries. And I do hope that you'll join me with Mr. Isaac Biggio and representatives from that community for a photo call. Please, if you can stay, then please do. And also then look forward to seeing as many of you for our briefing on artificial insemination. I wish. Artificial intelligence. I'm so excited about this briefing. In room 1.2. Okay, thank you. Meeting over.
Thank you very much, Chair.